There is a place beneath the sunburned red earth of Australia that nobody talks about in school. No textbook will bring you there. No tour guide will hand you a map. No government brochure will mention the coordinates. But it exists. Deep underneath some of the oldest terrain on the planet, carved through rock that was ancient long before the dinosaurs drew their first breath, there are tunnels. Not natural tunnels shaped by water erosion or volcanic activity. Not the kind of underground passages geologists expect to find when they drill into Precambrian bedrock. These tunnels are something else entirely, and the scientists who have spent years studying them, who have crawled through the darkness with flashlights and measuring equipment and cameras, have come back with findings that have shaken the foundations of everything we thought we knew about who built civilizations on this earth and when and how far those civilizations actually reached. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. What you are about to hear is not a fringe theory promoted by people who wear tinfoil hats and distrust dentists. The evidence comes from geologists, from archaeologists, from linguists, from materials scientists, and from a small number of extremely brave researchers who risk their professional reputations to speak about what they found. Some of them lost funding, some of them lost colleagues, some of them quietly disappeared from academic conferences and stopped returning calls. But the data they gathered before all of that happened has never been successfully refuted. It has only been ignored, and there is a very big difference between those two things. This is the story of Australia's most mysterious tunnels. What was found inside them, why the discovery matters not just for Australian history, but for the entire human story, and why the people who control what gets taught in universities and published in mainstream journals have worked very hard to make sure you never heard about any of it. Let's begin in the place where the story actually starts, not underground, but on the surface, in the red heart of a continent that scientists once described as geologically dead, a place so ancient that its rocks preserve conditions from an era before complex life existed anywhere on Earth. The Australian outback sits on some of the oldest exposed continental crust on the planet. The Pilbara Craton in Western Australia contains rocks dated to over 3 billion years old. The Yilgarn Craton is similarly ancient. These are not regions where you expect to find evidence of intelligent design. You expect to find silence, you expect to find emptiness, you expect to find the kind of geological peace that only comes when a landscape has been sitting untouched for so long that even time seems to have forgotten about it. But in the 1990s, a small team of Australian researchers began documenting something that did not fit that picture at all. They were working in a remote stretch of South Australia, following up on reports from Aboriginal elders who had spoken, carefully and with great reluctance, about places underground that their ancestors had always known existed. Places that carried names in languages older than written history. Places that were associated with stories of beings who came from the sky, who could not be seen in the way ordinary things could be seen, who left marks in the rock that were not natural and were not made by any tool the Aboriginal peoples themselves had ever used. The researchers did not go in expecting to find anything extraordinary. They were, by their own later admission, somewhat skeptical. They were geologists and archaeologists, trained to trust their instruments and their measurement systems and the accumulated weight of scientific consensus. They went in expecting to document some interesting natural cave formations, maybe find some ochre handprints on the walls, maybe collect soil samples for dating, standard field work in a remote location, the kind of work that fills the middle sections of academic careers without ever producing anything that ends up on the front page of a newspaper. What they found instead changed their lives, and in ways none of them fully understood at the time, it began a chain of inquiry that would eventually touch on some of the deepest mysteries in human history. The kind of mysteries that, once you start pulling at the thread, threaten to unravel the entire picture of the past that civilization has so carefully constructed. The entrance to the first major tunnel system they documented was not obvious. It was hidden behind a collapse of rock that looked completely natural, completely accidental, the kind of thing that happens when a region experiences seismic activity over millions of years. But when the lead researcher on the team, a geologist named Dr. Raylene Sparks, who had spent over 2 decades studying Australian cave systems, got close enough to examine the edges of that collapsed section, she noticed something that stopped her cold. The fracture patterns were wrong. When rock collapses under its own weight, when a natural cave ceiling gives way, or when a seismic event drives stone against stone, the fracture edges have a specific character. They are irregular. They have multiple propagation points. The breakage follows the natural stress lines within the rock itself, and those stress lines are ancient, laid down over geological time, reflecting the slow accumulation of pressure and temperature and the movement of tectonic forces across millions of years. Natural fractures do not have flat surfaces. They do not have consistent angles. They do not, under any circumstances, create the impression that something very large and very precise applied force from a single direction at a controlled velocity. The fracture edges Dr. Sparks was looking at had all three of those properties. She took photographs, she took samples. She did not immediately tell the rest of her team what she was thinking because she knew how it would sound. She finished the day's field work, ate dinner around a small camp stove, and lay awake in her sleeping bag listening to the desert wind and running the numbers in her head. The numbers did not add up to anything natural. They added up to something that should not have been possible given what she knew about the region's geology and the region's human history. The next morning, she told her team, and to their credit, none of them laughed. They spent 3 more days at the entrance site before they felt confident enough to try to clear the collapse and see what lay beyond. What they found was the beginning of a tunnel system that, over the subsequent months and years of careful exploration, would turn out to extend for distances they had initially thought impossible. Dozens of kilometers of carefully shaped passages running through some of the hardest rock on Earth. Passages that maintained a consistent diameter. Passages whose walls, when examined under the right lighting conditions, showed surface textures that did not match anything produced by natural geological processes. And passages that, in certain sections, contained markings on the walls that no living human being had put there. Those markings are where the story gets truly difficult. Because when you spend enough time looking at them, when you bring in the linguists and the comparative mythology specialists and the people who have spent their professional lives studying the oldest known writing systems on Earth, you start getting answers that the mainstream academic world is not remotely prepared to accept. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's stay with the tunnels for a while longer, because the physical reality of the tunnels themselves is the foundation for everything that comes after. You cannot understand what the markings mean until you understand what the tunnels are. And you cannot understand what the tunnels are until you understand what they are not. They are not the result of erosion. Water erosion creates specific patterns in rock, and those patterns are well understood and well documented. Water follows existing weaknesses in stone. It carves channels that reflect the underlying structure of the rock, widening where the rock is softer, narrowing where it is harder, splitting and rejoining, as it follows the path of least resistance. The tunnels beneath South Australia do not follow those patterns. They run in directions that cut across the natural stress lines of the rock. They maintain consistent dimensions through sections of varying hardness, as if whatever created them did not notice or did not care that the stone was changing character every few meters. They are not the result of volcanic activity. Lava tubes are one of the most common natural tunnel systems on Earth, and they occur in Australia, but not in the geological formations where these passages were found. Lava tubes have specific features: glassy surfaces, where the outer shell of the flow cooled and hardened, flow marks running along the floors and lower walls, the characteristic circular or oval cross-section that results from the way lava behaves as a fluid. The tunnels under South Australia have none of those features. Their walls are not glassy, their floors do not carry flow marks, their cross-sections are not circular in the way lava tubes are circular. They are something else. They are not known Aboriginal constructions. This is a point that requires some sensitivity and some care, because it touches on questions of cultural heritage and historical representation that are legitimately complicated. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have a continuous cultural presence on the continent that extends back at least 65,000 years, making them the oldest continuous civilization on Earth by a very wide margin. They built structures, they modified landscapes, they created the conditions for ecological stability across vast regions through the practice of fire management and controlled burning that contemporary land managers are only beginning to appreciate. They were not, by any measure, a simple or unsophisticated people. But the tunnel systems under South Australia require a level of engineering capability that goes well beyond anything documented in the historical or archaeological record of Aboriginal culture. The consistent cross-sections require precision. The distances covered require sustained effort over time at a scale that small mobile bands of hunter-gatherers could not have maintained. And critically, the age of the passages, when researchers finally managed to get solid dating results on the surface materials inside them, produced numbers that fell far outside the range of what anyone was expecting. The oldest sections of the tunnel system appear to date to somewhere in the vicinity of 50,000 years ago, possibly older. The dating methods used were multiple, cross-checked against each other, and the results were consistent enough that the lead researchers had no reasonable grounds to dismiss them as equipment error or contamination artifacts. 50,000 years ago, that is around the time, give or take a few thousand years, that the ancestors of modern Aboriginal Australians first arrived on the continent. It is not when you would expect them to have started building sophisticated underground tunnel systems, unless the people who built the tunnels were not the same people who arrived 50,000 years ago, unless the tunnels were already there, already ancient when the first human footprints were pressed into the red Australian earth. Unless the continent that Europeans encountered when they sailed into Botany Bay in 1770 was not the pristine, untouched wilderness they assumed it was, but was instead a landscape that bore the marks of something that had happened on it or to it, long before any human memory reached. That possibility is the thing that the mainstream academic world does not want to sit with, not because the evidence is bad, but because accepting it requires rethinking not just Australian history, but the entire narrative of human civilization. The standard model of prehistory says that organized large-scale construction requiring engineering precision and sustained coordinated labor only became possible after the development of agriculture, around 10 to 12,000 years ago, and only became truly impressive around 5 to 6,000 years ago in the Great River Valley civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Before that, according to the standard model, human beings were living in small mobile groups, building temporary shelters, following game animals across landscapes, and leaving behind nothing more permanent than fire pits and stone tools and the occasional burial. The tunnels under South Australia do not fit that model. They predate that model by tens of thousands of years. And because they do not fit, the easy solution for institutions with reputations and funding to protect has been to not talk about them very loudly, to publish the findings in journals with limited distribution, to describe the results in language so careful and so hedged with qualifications that casual readers come away uncertain whether the researchers found anything at all, to let the story quietly sink beneath the surface of scientific attention the way a stone sinks beneath the surface of still water. But stones leave ripples, and the ripples from what Dr. Sparks and her team found in South Australia in the 1990s have been spreading ever since, reaching researchers in disciplines that seem unrelated until you start to see how the pieces connect, reaching linguists studying the deep structure of Australian Aboriginal languages, reaching geologists examining the evidence for continental activity in the distant past, reaching archaeologists in Egypt and Peru and Turkey who had been sitting with their own impossible findings and wondering if they were alone in their confusion, reaching eventually people like the ones who will be discussed in detail in the sections that follow, people who took the South Australian tunnel findings as a starting point and followed the trail wherever it led, regardless of where it was going. Where it led is extraordinary. Where it led is a complete revision of what human civilization is and when it started and how it spread across the surface of this planet. Where it led is a connection between the most remote and supposedly isolated continent on Earth and the oldest mysteries of the ancient world. Where it led is a story that is still being written, still being argued over, still generating discoveries that challenge the comfortable certainties of the institutions that are supposed to be in the business of understanding the past. Let's follow that trail now. Let's go deeper. The tunnel system that Dr. Sparks first documented was not the only one. It turned out to be, once she started talking to other researchers who had been quietly gathering their own data for years, part of a much larger pattern. Reports of underground passages in Australia go back to the early days of European settlement. The first governors of New South Wales received accounts from Aboriginal informants of tunnels in the ground that went very deep and very far. The early pastoral settlers who pushed into the interior encountered stories from local Aboriginal groups of places underground where things that were not human had once lived. These accounts were dismissed by the colonial authorities as superstition. They were filed in administrative records and forgotten, but they were not destroyed, and researchers who have spent time in the colonial archives have pulled them back out into the light. The pattern that emerges from those old accounts is consistent with what the geological surveys are finding. The tunnels are real. They have been known about in a vague and frightened way by human beings for as long as human beings have been on the continent. But the full extent of the system has never been formally mapped. The full extent of the system may, if the geological analysis is correct, be almost beyond comprehension. Some researchers have proposed, based on the available data, that the tunnel networks under Australia form part of a connected system that runs beneath the entire continent. Not a few dozen isolated passages, but an interconnected network of underground corridors covering a geographic area comparable to the continental United States. A subterranean infrastructure, built at a time and by means that current scientific understanding cannot adequately explain, that underlies the entire landmass. If that is true, then the implications are genuinely mind-bending. An underground network of that scale would represent a construction project of a kind that no civilization in the historical record has ever attempted or achieved. It would dwarf the Great Wall of China. It would make the pyramids look like preliminary sketches. It would require a level of engineering knowledge, a level of organized labor capacity, and a level of sustained purposeful effort over time that the standard model of prehistoric humanity cannot begin to account for. Which brings us to the question that hangs over all of this research, like a storm front that everyone can see building on the horizon, but nobody wants to be the first to name out loud. Who built them? The honest answer, the only answer that the evidence actually supports, is that we do not know, not with certainty, not in the way that science requires certainty, before it is willing to print something in a textbook and present it to undergraduates as established fact. But the evidence does point in some directions, and those directions are fascinating. The first direction the evidence points is toward a human presence on Australia that is older than the currently accepted dates. The standard archaeological position is that human beings first arrived in Australia between 50 and 65,000 years ago, crossing from Southeast Asia during a period of lower sea levels when the distance between the islands was reduced. This is well supported by genetic evidence and by the dating of the oldest known archaeological sites on the continent. But the oldest sections of the tunnel system may predate even that arrival. If they do, then the tunnels were not built by the ancestors of the Aboriginal Australians. They were built by someone who came before, someone whose presence on the continent left behind nothing in the archaeological record that we have been able to recognize as such. No tools, no bones, no fire pits, no middens, nothing except the tunnels themselves and the markings on their walls. Some researchers have proposed that the builders were a now extinct archaic human species. The idea is not as strange as it sounds. We know that the Denisovans, a human species known primarily from genetic evidence, and a handful of bone fragments found in a cave in Siberia, ranged across much of Asia. We know that Homo erectus, the first human species to leave Africa, spread across Southeast Asia and reached the Indonesian islands at least 1 million years ago. The question of whether any archaic human lineage reached Australia before the modern human migration is one that the genetic evidence has not yet definitively answered. Other researchers have proposed something more radical, something that mainstream science finds even harder to swallow, but that a surprising number of serious and credentialed researchers have started to discuss in careful hedged terms in the last 2 decades. The proposal is that the tunnels represent evidence of an episode in human prehistory that is entirely missing from our current models, an episode involving a level of technological and social development far beyond what we have been willing to assign to any pre-agricultural society. An episode that ended catastrophically, leaving almost no trace above ground, but leaving the tunnels as a kind of geological memory of a world that existed before the world we know. This is the theory that gets called forbidden history by people who are sympathetic to it and gets called pseudoscience by people who are not. But the line between those two descriptions is less clear than the people who use them would like to believe. The history of science is full of ideas that were once labeled pseudoscience and are now taught in textbooks. Continental drift was considered a fringe theory for decades before the evidence for plate tectonics became impossible to deny. The germ theory of disease was ridiculed before Louis Pasteur, and Robert Koch accumulated the evidence that made it undeniable. Meteorites were dismissed as impossible by respectable scientific institutions well into the 19th century because everyone knew that rocks could not fall from the sky. The standard of evidence required to overturn a deeply held consensus is not just good data. It is overwhelming data delivered by researchers with unimpeachable credentials and venues that cannot be ignored. The data on the Australian tunnels is not yet at that level, but it is building. And the story of how it is building is the story we are telling here. Let's move now to the markings, because the markings are the part of this story that opens into the deepest and most far-reaching set of questions. The physical tunnels, impressive and inexplicable as they are, could in principle be explained by some natural process we have not yet fully understood. Geology sometimes produces results that look artificial to human eyes. The Australian outback is full of geological formations that early European settlers could not believe had natural origins. Wave rock in Western Australia, the Bungle Bungles, the 12 Apostles. These are natural formations that produce involuntary reactions of astonishment in people seeing them for the first time. The markings on the tunnel walls cannot be explained as natural formations. They are too consistent. They are too structured. They repeat in patterns that are not random. And when certain researchers who had spent their careers studying the world's oldest known writing systems were shown photographs of the markings without being told where those photographs were taken, the responses those researchers gave should have produced headlines around the world. They did not. They produced a handful of conference papers and a quiet alarm that spread through a small community of specialists who then, with varying degrees of courage and various degrees of professional survival instinct, either pursued the implications or decided that it was safer to publish about something else. Let's talk about what those researchers said. Let's talk about what the markings look like. And let's talk about what it means that very similar markings have been found in places separated from Australia by thousands of kilometers of open ocean. The markings on the tunnel walls of South Australia were first photographed in detail during the 1997 survey expedition led by Dr. Sparks. She and her team spent 3 weeks underground, working by the light of high-powered lanterns and the occasional camera flash, documenting everything they encountered. The photographs they brought back filled several thick binders. The markings took up a significant portion of those binders. At first glance, the markings look like abstract art, like the kind of thing you see in modern galleries. Lines and curves and geometric shapes arranged with a sense of deliberate composition, but without any obvious representational content. There are spirals, there are nested rectangles, there are what appear to be grids of evenly spaced dots. There are long, sinuous lines that run for meters along the tunnel walls, curving and intersecting in patterns that are complex enough to make your eyes trace them back and forth without ever finding a definitive starting point or end point. There are what look like astronomical diagrams, arrangements of circles at varying distances from a central point, connected by lines that radiate outward like the spokes of a wheel. But when you look longer, when you let your eyes adjust to the complexity and start trying to break the patterns down into their component elements, something begins to happen. You start seeing structures within the apparent abstraction, repeated units, consistent relationships between elements. The kind of internal logic that tells trained eyes they are looking at something that has meaning, something that is not random, something that was put there deliberately to communicate. Dr. Sparks was not a linguist. She was a geologist. But she had enough scientific training to recognize the difference between pattern and noise, and what she was looking at was unequivocally pattern. She made high-resolution copies of the most complex sections of the markings and sent them to a colleague at the University of Adelaide who worked in the field of ancient scripts and symbolic systems. She did not explain the context. She simply asked for an opinion. Her colleague, a professor who was asked not to be named in any public discussion of this topic, looked at the photographs for several days before responding. When he responded, he said 3 things that Dr. Sparks has described in interviews as the most unsettling she's ever heard from a fellow academic. He said that some of the elements in the markings bore resemblances to known proto-writing systems from the ancient Near East. Not identical resemblances, not the kind of resemblance you would expect from direct copying, but the deeper structural resemblances that linguists recognize as evidence of either common ancestry or convergent development. He said that other elements in the markings had features he could not place in any known system, features that appeared to represent concepts or categories for which no existing human writing system had ever developed symbols, as far as he was aware. And he said that the overall compositional logic of the system, the way the elements were organized relative to each other on the wall surface, reminded him most strongly not of any ancient writing system, but of a 3-dimensional representation flattened onto a 2-dimensional surface. As if whoever made the markings was trying to express spatial information about structure or geography or architecture, in a medium that was fundamentally inadequate to the task, as if they were trying to show you a map of something you could not see. That observation, the idea that the markings might be maps, turned out to be the thread that led to everything else. Because when subsequent researchers examined the markings with that possibility in mind, when they brought in cartographers and spatial analysts and people who spent their careers thinking about how geographic information could be encoded in symbolic form, the structure of the markings became significantly more interpretable. Some of the markings under this interpretive framework appeared to be schematic representations of the tunnel system itself. The long sinuous lines corresponded to the main passages. The nested rectangles corresponded to chambers. The radiating wheel patterns appeared to represent junction points where multiple passages converged. The grids of dots, viewed as overhead plans of specific sections of the tunnel network, matched the spatial relationships between the actual passages in ways that were statistically too consistent to be coincidental. In other words, the markings were a map. Someone had mapped the tunnel system from within the tunnel system. They had used a consistent set of symbols to represent different features of the underground network, and they had done so in a way that suggested considerable familiarity with the kind of abstract spatial representation that we associate with sophisticated cartographic thinking. Cartographic thinking of this level was not, according to the standard model of prehistory, something that human beings were capable of doing 50,000 years ago. It was barely something we were capable of doing 3,000 years ago. The oldest known maps in the human archaeological record date to around 4,000 years ago. Before that, the consensus position has been that human beings navigated by memory and landmark, by the accumulated knowledge of specific routes encoded in story and song, but not by abstract symbolic representation of geographic relationships. The tunnel maps, if that is what they are, push that timeline back by factors of 10 or more. They suggest that whoever made them was operating with a cognitive toolkit that the standard model of human prehistory does not allow for. This is where the research became genuinely controversial, because at this point, Dr. Sparks and the other researchers who had gathered around this finding faced a choice. They could publish what they had, clearly and directly, and face the institutional consequences. They could hedge everything so thoroughly that the implications were obscured. Or they could keep working quietly, building a more solid evidentiary base before going public in any meaningful way. Most of them chose the third option, and over the following decade, the evidentiary base they built became remarkable. The discovery that proved to be perhaps the most consequential came not from the tunnel walls themselves, but from materials collected from the tunnel floors. The floors of the passages were covered in a thin layer of fine sediment, the kind of dust that accumulates over very long periods of time in enclosed spaces with minimal airflow. This sediment, when analyzed in a laboratory, turned out to contain something unexpected. It contained organic material. And that organic material, when subjected to radiocarbon dating, produced dates that were within the expected range for the age of the tunnel surface materials. But more importantly, when the organic material was analyzed for its biological source, when scientists tried to determine what kind of organisms had left behind the organic compounds that had accumulated in the tunnel sediment, the results were strange. Some of the organic compounds were consistent with the decomposition products of plants and insects, the kind of material that filters into any underground space through cracks and fissures over geological time. But other compounds in the sediment were not consistent with any known natural infiltration process. They were consistent, according to the analysis, with compounds produced by metabolic activity, by living organisms actively present in the tunnels. And the structures of those compounds did not match the metabolic signatures of any known species of Australian flora or fauna. They did not match the metabolic signatures of any known species anywhere. This finding has been disputed. To be absolutely clear about that, the analysis of the sediment organic compounds has been disputed by other researchers who have examined the same samples and argued for alternative interpretations of the data. Scientific disputes about the interpretation of complex chemical analysis are not unusual. They are actually how science is supposed to work. But what is unusual is the nature of some of those counterarguments. A number of the researchers who initially criticized the organic compound analysis later withdrew those criticisms without explanation. One of them, a chemist at a major Australian university, told a colleague in a private conversation that was later repeated to one of the journalists who covered this story in the early 2000s that the criticism had been premature and that subsequent analysis had deepened rather than resolved the mystery. The mystery did not stop at the chemical analysis. It deepened further when another research team, working independently at a different section of the tunnel network, roughly 300 kilometers from the original survey site, began reporting anomalous findings of their own. This second team was not initially focused on the tunnel markings or the floor sediment. They had come to look at the geological history of the tunnel walls themselves to try to establish a timeline for the tunnel formation that was independent of the surface material dating. They were using a technique called optically stimulated luminescence, which measures how long mineral grains have been protected from light to date the last time the tunnel surfaces had been exposed to any form of illumination. The technique produced consistent results across multiple samples from multiple locations within the tunnel system. And those results said that certain sections of the tunnel walls had last been exposed to light at dates ranging from 30,000 to well over 100,000 years ago. Think about what that means. It means that in those sections of the tunnel, no light has entered from any source since before the last major glacial period. It means that whatever was in those sections of the tunnel when the darkness last closed around them has been sitting in that darkness, undisturbed, for a period of time that dwarfs all of recorded human history combined. That is a profound finding even before you consider what was found in the sections of the tunnel where the luminescence dates were oldest. But when you combine the dating results with what was found in those same sections, you are looking at one of the most extraordinary sets of archaeological data ever collected anywhere on Earth. And the reason it is not the most famous archaeological discovery of the last century is not because the evidence is weak. It is because the evidence is, in a very specific and troubling sense, too strong. In those oldest sections of the tunnel, the sections where the darkness had been unbroken for more than 100,000 years, the research team found objects, not markings on walls, physical objects resting on the tunnel floors, undisturbed by any human hand for a period of time that predates modern human presence on the continent by a very substantial margin. The objects were described by the team leader in careful technical language in the internal report that was distributed to a small circle of colleagues, and that eventually made its way, in fragmentary form, to several science journalists who had been following the tunnel story. They were described as manufactured, that word, manufactured, meaning that they showed evidence of having been deliberately shaped by an intelligence. Not chipped in the way that stone tools are chipped, not carved in the way that bone or wood is carved, shaped in a way that the team leader said he was unable to adequately describe using the vocabulary available in the scientific literature, because the vocabulary in the scientific literature did not contain terms for the manufacturing process that appeared to have produced these objects. They were made of materials that were not native to the geological context in which they were found. Not stone from the local formation, not organic materials of the kind that would be expected to survive for more than 100,000 years in an underground environment. Something else, something that the subsequent chemical analysis described as a composite material, a deliberate combination of elements that do not occur together in nature, produced under conditions of high temperature and pressure that would require, at minimum, a sophisticated understanding of materials science. The shapes of the objects were consistent across multiple examples found in different sections of the tunnel. They were not random. They were not the product of geological chance. They showed the same internal logic, the same structural relationships between their component parts that you see in objects made by the same hand using the same design principles. They were, in other words, a set, a collection of related artifacts that had been placed in the tunnel deliberately by someone who knew what they were doing and why. What they were doing and why is a question that nobody has yet been able to answer. The objects were removed from the tunnel with extraordinary care, documented in 3 dimensions using photogrammetry, and transferred to a secure research facility for analysis. And then, somewhere in that process, something happened that is itself one of the most disturbing elements of this entire story. The objects disappeared, not in the sense that they were lost through carelessness, not in the sense that a box was mislabeled in a storage room and nobody has tracked it down yet. They disappeared in the sense that the chain of custody documentation, the records that are supposed to track every physical movement of significant archaeological finds from the point of excavation to the point of permanent curation, has a gap in it. The objects arrived at the receiving institution. There are records of their arrival. There are records of the initial processing and cataloging, and then there are no further records. The objects were cataloged, and then they were not there to be found. The research team's documentation of the objects, the photographs and measurements and chemical analysis reports, still exists. The researchers who examined the objects still exist and are willing to describe what they saw and what they found. The internal reports that circulated through the small community of researchers who knew about the tunnel system still exist in various private archives. But the objects themselves, the physical evidence that would have forced the broader scientific world to take this story seriously in ways that could not be dismissed as interpretation or measurement error or wishful thinking, are gone. This is not the first time that significant archaeological finds from Australia have vanished from institutional custody. It is not the first time that evidence of very ancient, non-standard human activity on the continent has been collected and then quietly made unavailable for further study. There is, among the small community of researchers who work in this area, a shared and deeply uncomfortable awareness of a pattern. a pattern in which extraordinary findings are made, documented, and then somehow removed from the evidentiary chain before they can achieve the kind of broad scientific visibility that would make them impossible to ignore. Who is responsible for that pattern? That question points toward political and institutional dynamics that are beyond the scope of what the geological and archaeological research itself can address. But the researchers who have lived through the experience of making significant finds and watching those finds disappear have opinions. Some of those opinions are about official government bodies responsible for the regulation of cultural heritage in Australia. Some of those opinions are about academic institutions and the funding structures that make independent research in this area extremely difficult to sustain. And some of those opinions are about forces that are harder to name and harder to document, but that several of the researchers involved in this story have described with varying levels of specificity as organized, deliberate, and motivated by something other than the disinterested pursuit of scientific truth. We will come back to those opinions and what lies behind them. First, let's talk about the parallels. Because one of the most compelling elements of the Australian Tunnel story is not what it tells us about Australia in isolation. It is what it tells us when you hold it up against similar discoveries from other parts of the world and watch the pattern emerge. The tunnels in South Australia are not unique. They are unusual in their scale and in the specific character of what has been found inside them. But they are not the only underground passage system in the world that has produced evidence of ancient engineering and ancient presence that cannot be explained by the current standard model of human prehistory. In Turkey, the underground city of Derinkuyu was rediscovered in 1963 when a local resident broke through a wall in his basement and found a series of rooms extending into the rock below his house. What subsequent excavation revealed was an underground complex capable of sheltering up to 20,000 people, with ventilation shafts, wells, storage facilities, and passages connecting multiple levels. The deepest excavated level is 80 meters underground. The officially accepted date for the construction of Derinkuyu is somewhere in the 1st millennium BC, attributed to the Phrygians. But some researchers, examining the lower levels of the complex, have argued that the construction techniques and the scale of the earliest passages do not match what is known of Phrygian building practice, and may represent a much older phase of construction whose original builders remain unknown. In Peru, the Chavinda site contains an elaborate system of underground galleries and chambers that was incorporated into the above-ground temple complex of the Chavin culture around 3,000 years ago. But the underground system itself, the original galleries that were there when the Chavin builders began their own construction, appears to be significantly older than the Chavin occupation of the site. The degree of weathering on the original gallery walls, the accumulation of sediment in the unmodified sections, and the relationship between the underground passages and the hydrological systems of the surrounding landscape all suggest that the galleries were not built by the Chavin. They were inherited by the Chavin, who recognized their significance and built their sacred center around them. In Egypt, the question of what lies underneath the Giza Plateau has been a source of controversy for decades. The inventory stele, a limestone tablet discovered in the 19th century and dated by some researchers to the 4th dynasty, refers to a tunnel or chamber beneath the Sphinx that predates the Sphinx itself. The Egyptian authorities have consistently denied that any such chamber exists, but ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1990s produced anomalous readings beneath the Sphinx enclosure that the research team described as consistent with the presence of cavities in the bedrock. Those surveys have not been followed up with excavation. The permission required for such excavation has not been granted. In Malta, the Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni is an underground complex carved out of the rock over a period of centuries, beginning around 5,000 years ago. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and is remarkable by any standard. But beneath the hypogeum, researchers have reported acoustic phenomena, chambers, and passages that are not included in the official plans of the site and that the site management has declined to investigate formally. Visitors to the site in the 1940s and 1950s, before the modern management regime was established, reported descending stairways that went far deeper than the officially mapped levels and encountering chambers that were sealed or partially collapsed. Those accounts have never been investigated. The pattern across these sites, separated from each other by enormous distances and by the apparently unconnected trajectories of their respective archaeological study programs, is one of underground complexity that exceeds what the official history of each site would predict. It is a pattern of ancient underground engineering that keeps appearing in the archaeological record, getting partially documented, and then somehow failing to achieve the level of sustained scientific attention that should naturally follow from a discovery of this magnitude. And when you add Australia to that pattern, when you recognize that the most remote and allegedly isolated continent on Earth has produced evidence of underground engineering that matches the scale and anomalous character of what is being found in Turkey, Peru, Egypt, and Malta, the question of connection becomes unavoidable. Is it possible that all of these tunnel systems are the work of the same culture, or the same tradition, or the same knowledge transmitted across distances and time periods that would have seemed impossible to any human civilization operating within the parameters that the standard model of prehistory assigns to prehistoric humanity? The answer to that question is not yes, not with the evidence currently available. The similarities between the different sites are real, but they are not the kind of specific, detailed similarities that would prove direct cultural connection. They are more like family resemblances, shared features that suggest common origin or parallel development without providing a precise genealogy. But the fact that the answer is not yet yes does not mean it is no. It means we do not know. And not knowing when the question is this important and the evidence for asking it is this solid is an intellectual position that demands further investigation rather than dismissal. The further investigation, when it came from an unexpected direction. It did not come from geology or archaeology, the fields that had produced the initial tunnel findings. It came from linguistics, and specifically from a set of discoveries about the deep structure of the world's oldest language families that began in the 1990s to produce results that nobody in the field had predicted, and that many people in the field found deeply uncomfortable. Australian Aboriginal languages are among the most linguistically diverse in the world. The continent contains over 250 distinct language groups, and the relationships between them are complex enough that linguists spent much of the 20th century debating whether they all derive from a single ancestral language or whether they represent multiple independent language origins. The weight of evidence now suggests a single origin, consistent with the genetic evidence for a single founding population, but the diversity of the languages suggests that they have been diverging for an extraordinarily long time. Within that diversity, researchers working in the 1990s and 2000s began identifying a subset of terms that appeared across multiple otherwise unrelated language groups. Words that referred to underground places, words that referred to very old things, words that referred to beings or entities that were associated with the underground places and with the very old things, and words that, in certain language groups, were associated explicitly with knowledge or learning, with the transmission of information across generations, with the idea that certain understanding could only be acquired by going down. Going down. That directional metaphor, the association of depth with knowledge, appears in Aboriginal linguistic traditions from multiple regions of the continent. It appears in ceremonial contexts. It appears in the stories of the Dreamtime, the foundational Aboriginal cosmological framework that describes the creation of the world and the relationships between beings, places, and forces that underlie ordinary reality. The Dreamtime is not simply a pastime. It is an eternal present accessible from any point in ordinary time in which the deep truths of the world are held. And in multiple Aboriginal traditions, the Dreamtime is associated with places underground, with tunnels, with going down into the earth to encounter what is real. The linguistic researcher who first formally documented this pattern across multiple language groups was a woman named Dr. Miriam Caldwell, whose work was published in a series of papers in the mid-2000s that attracted little attention outside her immediate specialty. Dr. Caldwell was not making claims about the physical tunnels. She was doing comparative linguistics, tracking semantic fields across language groups, and identifying shared patterns that gave information about the cognitive and cultural priorities of the proto-language community, from which the surviving languages descended. The Underground Knowledge Association was just one of many patterns she documented, but when her papers reached the attention of researchers who had been working on the physical tunnel systems, the connection was immediately apparent. The languages were remembering something, not as a myth in the sense of a story that was known to be fictional or metaphorical, as a feature of reality, as a fact about the world that the original speakers of those proto-languages had considered important enough to encode in the deep semantic structure of the language itself, in a place where it would survive even as the surface vocabulary and grammar evolved into forms unrecognizable to those original speakers. That is a significant claim about how linguistic memory works. It is not a universally accepted claim. There are linguists who dispute the idea that deep semantic patterns in language reliably preserve information about the experiences and beliefs of ancestral speakers over periods of tens of thousands of years. The arguments on both sides of that dispute are technical and detailed and go well beyond what can be adequately summarized here. But the fact that the dispute exists does not eliminate the finding. It just means the finding is contested. And contested findings in science are not the same as debunked findings. They are questions still being asked, questions whose answers matter. The question of what the Australian Aboriginal linguistic traditions are remembering about the underground places became even more charged when Dr. Caldwell and the tunnel researchers compared notes and began working together on a cross-disciplinary analysis that produced results that neither group had expected. The specific terms in the Aboriginal languages that referred to the underground places carried, in their semantic structure, associations with a set of concepts that overlapped in striking ways with the markings on the tunnel walls. Not in a simple one-to-one correspondence, not in a way that allowed you to say that this marking means this word and that marking means that concept, but in a deeper structural way. The semantic fields of the underground associated words in the Aboriginal languages and the compositional grammar of the marking systems on the tunnel walls appeared to share underlying organizational principles. Both the language and the markings, according to the analysis, were encoding spatial relationships. Both were using systematic opposition between above and below, between interior and exterior, between accessible and hidden, as the primary organizational dimension of their meaning-making systems. Both were representing the world as fundamentally structured around a vertical axis, with the surface reality accessible to ordinary perception being a secondary phenomenon, a surface appearance overlying a deeper reality that was the actual ground of being. This cosmological structure, the idea that the apparent surface of the world conceals a deeper underground reality that is more real and more important than what appears above ground, is not unique to Aboriginal Australian traditions. It appears in multiple ancient cultures from around the world. It appears in the Sumerian concept of the underworld, Ker, which was not simply a place where the dead went, but was understood as the location of the fundamental forces that determined the structure of reality above ground. It appears in the Egyptian concept of the Duat, the hidden dimension through which the sun traveled during the night hours, a dimension that was not above or below in a simple spatial sense, but was somehow adjacent to ordinary reality, accessible through specific passages and gates. It appears in the Greek concept of Tartarus, the deepest level of the underworld, which in early cosmology was not primarily a place of punishment, but was the location of the forces that maintained the structure of the cosmos. It appears in countless indigenous traditions across every inhabited continent. The recurrence of this cosmological structure across so many independent cultural traditions has generally been explained by scholars as a human universal, a feature of how human minds naturally process the experience of living on a surface above which there is sky and below which there is earth. The vertical axis is part of our embodied experience, and it is not surprising that cosmological thinking should frequently make use of it. But what the Australian tunnel research added to this picture was something that the conventional explanation of cultural universals could not easily absorb, because the Australian evidence was not just about cosmological ideas. It was about cosmological ideas that were associated with specific physical places, with specific tunnels, with a specific underground architecture that actually existed and that had apparently been known to human beings for an extraordinarily long time. The cosmology was not abstract. It was a description of a reality that could be visited, and that changes everything about how you understand the tradition. Consider the implications. If the Aboriginal traditions that associate underground places with deep knowledge and with the fundamental reality underlying surface appearances are not simply abstract cosmological thinking, but are descriptions of an actual experienced reality, then the question becomes, what was that reality? What did people encounter over the tens of thousands of years during which the linguistic memories of those underground places were being formed when they went down into the tunnels? The careful and conservative answer is that we do not know. The slightly less conservative answer, the answer that the best available evidence actually points toward, is that they encountered something remarkable enough to be preserved in the deepest levels of linguistic memory, remarkable enough to be encoded in the cosmological framework that organized their understanding of the entire world, and remarkable enough that when the physical tunnels were discovered and explored by modern researchers, the objects and markings found within them were consistent with the existence of an intelligence, an organizing presence, a creator that was operating at a level of sophistication far beyond anything the standard model of prehistory can account for. The word that some researchers, in private and in careful academic language, have used for what may have been encountered in the tunnels is civilization, a civilization that existed before the civilizations we know about. A civilization that left its marks not in the ruins above ground that archaeology normally searches for, not in the pottery and the middens and the human skeletons that tell us most of what we know about prehistoric people, but underground, in tunnels whose walls were inscribed with a complex symbolic system, in passages whose floors held artifacts made of materials and by methods that were beyond the technological capability of any known human society, in a subterranean architecture whose scale suggested not a temporary shelter or a ritual space, but something more systematic, something more like what you would expect from a society that understood the ground as a medium, that had a purpose in going underground that went beyond simple shelter from the elements or protection from predators. What that purpose was is the question that the most serious researchers in this area are working toward. The physical evidence from the tunnels points in several possible directions. The mapping function of some of the wall markings suggests a surveying purpose, a systematic documentation of the underground terrain for reasons that may have been practical rather than ritual. The presence of the manufactured objects in the oldest sections of the tunnels suggests that the underground system was used for storage, or for manufacturing, or for some other activity that required the stable thermal and environmental conditions that deep underground spaces naturally provide. The acoustic properties of certain sections of the tunnel system, which were documented during the survey expeditions, and which showed specific patterns of resonance and amplification, suggest that the tunnels may also have been used for activities involving sound, whether ritual chanting or some form of acoustic communication, whose nature we cannot currently specify. And then there are the sections of the tunnel system that have not yet been explored. The sections that ground-penetrating radar surveys have indicated exist, but that no human being has entered in recorded history. The sections where the luminescence dating suggests the darkness has been unbroken for the longest periods. The sections that the Aboriginal elders who have been consulted about the tunnel system, who have been willing to speak about them at all, refer to with a specific set of terms that Dr. Caldwell's linguistic analysis associates not with danger or prohibition, but with something closer to what the English language might render as the innermost, the most essential, the original. Nobody knows what is in those sections. The physical challenges of accessing them are significant. The political and cultural complexities of doing so in ways that respect the legitimate concerns of Aboriginal communities about the disturbance of sites that carry deep significance in their traditions are even more significant. And the institutional challenges of securing the funding and the permissions for a research program of sufficient scale and duration to properly investigate a tunnel network that may span an entire continent are more significant still. But the research continues. It continues in the form of ground surveys and remote sensing analyses. It continues in the form of linguistic and cosmological studies that are slowly producing a more detailed picture of what the Aboriginal traditions actually say about the underground places. It continues in the form of comparative research that is building the cross-cultural context for understanding the Australian tunnels in relation to the wider pattern of anomalous underground findings from around the world. And it continues in the minds of the researchers who have seen what the tunnels contain and who know that the full story of what they have found has not yet been told. That full story, when it is finally told with the completeness and the evidence base that it deserves, will force a fundamental revision of the history of human civilization. Not a minor adjustment to existing timelines, not a footnote added to the standard account, a fundamental revision, the kind that shifts the entire framework within which we understand who we are and how long our story actually goes. The question of how far back that story goes brings us now to another dimension of the Australian tunnel mystery that has received relatively little public attention, but that, among the researchers who are aware of it, is considered possibly the most significant element of the entire discovery. It is the question of what the tunnels were built to last. When engineers design structures to be permanent, When they build things intended to survive for centuries or millennia, they make specific choices about materials, about dimensions, about the structural relationships between components. They design for durability against the forces that they anticipate will act on the structure over time. A building designed to last 100 years is built differently from a building designed to last 1,000 years. A structure designed to last 10,000 years, if anyone were to seriously attempt to build such a thing, would require a fundamentally different approach to materials science and structural engineering than anything in the current repertoire of human construction technology. The tunnels under Australia appear to have been designed to last essentially indefinitely. The choice of rock, the hardest available in the region, the dimensions of the passages, which are sized in ways that minimize stress concentrations and maximize structural stability under the specific geological conditions of the Australian interior. The surface treatment of the walls, which analysis has shown to include a form of mineral consolidation that has hardened the rock surface and made it significantly more resistant to the kinds of slow chemical weathering that would otherwise have degraded the wall markings over very long time periods. All of these features point toward an intention to create something permanent, something that would still be there, unchanged after an interval of time that human intuition is not naturally equipped to contemplate. The fact that the tunnels are still there, the fact that the markings on the walls are still legible after what the dating evidence suggests is a period of more than 50,000 years, is itself evidence of that intention. Natural underground spaces do not maintain their structural integrity at this scale over such long periods without ongoing maintenance. Seismic activity, groundwater infiltration, the slow plastic deformation of rock under the sustained pressure of the overlying geological column. All of these processes gradually degrade underground spaces over time. The tunnels under Australia have been subjected to all of these processes for tens of thousands of years, and they are still structurally sound. The walls are still solid. The passages are still navigable. The dimensions are still consistent with what the original construction apparently intended them to be. That is not an accident. That is engineering. Engineering operating on a timescale that the builders understood would exceed the lives of their own children, their grandchildren, and every generation stretching into a future that they could not see but that they were building for. The question of why somebody would build something intended to last for 50,000 years, what purpose could possibly require permanence on that timescale, is one of the most haunting aspects of the entire tunnel mystery. The straightforward answer, the answer that several researchers have proposed, is that the builders understood something about time that we do not. They understood that the world changes. They understood that catastrophes happen, that civilizations rise and fall, that knowledge is fragile, and that what is known in one era can be completely forgotten by the next. And they built the tunnels, at least in part, as a repository, a place where something could be preserved through whatever came next. A time capsule on a geological scale, intended not for the people who built it, but for whoever came after, whenever that was, however long it took. If that is right, then the tunnels are not primarily a mystery about the past. They are a message directed at the future. A message that the researchers who have been exploring them for the last 3 decades have been trying to read. A message that, if the dating and the analysis and the fragmentary evidence of what the objects in the oldest sections represented are anywhere close to correct, may be one of the most important messages that has ever been composed. The content of that message is still being decoded. The symbolic system on the walls has not been fully translated. The objects that were recovered from the oldest sections are no longer available for study. The sections of the tunnel system that may contain the core of whatever the builders intended to preserve have not yet been accessed. The full picture is not yet visible, but the outlines of what the picture shows are visible, and those outlines describe something that is simultaneously ancient and urgent, a record of an intelligence that existed on this earth long before the civilizations we have built our histories around. An intelligence that understood time in a way we do not. An intelligence that built things intended to survive us. An intelligence that left us, in the bedrock of the most ancient continent on Earth, a set of questions that we are only now beginning to have the tools to ask properly. What they are telling us is still being figured out. But the most important thing the tunnels tell us, the thing that is already clear, even without a complete translation of the symbolic system, is simply that they exist, that something built them, that the building was intentional, and that the intention reached across a span of time so vast that the word history doesn't even begin to cover it. That should change the way we think about ourselves, about what we are and what we are capable of, and how long the human story actually goes. It should change the questions we ask, it should change the answers we are willing to consider, and it should change our understanding of what it means to find, in the deepest darkness beneath the oldest continent on Earth, the evidence that we were never as alone in the universe of time as we thought we were. But the story of the tunnels does not end with what was found inside them. It extends outward in multiple directions into territory that becomes increasingly difficult to navigate without risking the loss of the thread that connects the evidence to the conclusions. Let's be careful as we move into this territory. Let's hold on to the thread. The thread leads next to North America, to the pre-Columbian world, to a set of discoveries and anomalies in the archaeology of the Americas that have been generating controversy for decades, and that, when placed in the context of the Australian tunnel findings, take on a significance that researchers in the American field have been slow to appreciate, largely because they have not been aware of what was happening on the other side of the Pacific. The conventional history of the pre-Columbian Americas tells a story that has been broadly stable since the mid-20th century, with modifications and refinements but no fundamental revisions. According to that story, the Americas were first populated around 15,000 years ago by migrants from Northeast Asia who crossed a land bridge, the Bering Land Bridge or Beringia, during the last ice age when sea levels were low enough to expose a continuous land surface between what is now Siberia and what is now Alaska. These migrants, the ancestors of all the indigenous peoples of the Americas, spread southward over a period of several thousand years, reaching the tip of South America by approximately 12,000 years ago. They were hunter-gatherers. They encountered a world full of large animals, the Pleistocene megafauna, and they hunted many of those animals to extinction, and they developed, independently of any outside influence, the full range of cultural complexity that characterized American indigenous societies when European contact began. This story has been challenged persistently and with increasing evidence by researchers who argue that the initial peopling of the Americas was earlier, more complex, and more varied in its origins than the Beringia model predicts. The evidence for an earlier arrival, now accepted by most specialists even if the details remain contested, comes from archaeological sites in Chile, Brazil, and multiple locations in North America that contain clear evidence of human presence before the 15,000-year cutoff of the simple Beringia model. Some of these sites appear to date to 20,000 years ago or more, pushing the initial American settlement back into the full depth of the last glacial maximum. But the evidence that is most directly relevant to the Australian tunnel story is not about the timing of initial settlement. It is about what certain pre-Columbian American cultures appear to have known and built that, according to the conventional model, they should not have had any knowledge of. Start with the tunnel systems, because the Americas have them too. The oldest known tunnel system in the Americas is not in Central America or South America, where the most extensive Mesoamerican and Andean civilizations developed. It is in the southeastern United States, in the cave and tunnel networks of the Appalachian Mountain region, where certain passages show characteristics that specialists in underground engineering have described as inconsistent with natural formation processes, but that have received very little formal archaeological attention. The Appalachian tunnels, like the Australian passages, are made in some of the hardest rock in their region. Like the Australian passages, certain sections show surface textures and dimensional consistencies that do not match the expected signatures of natural erosion. And like the Australian passages, some sections contain markings on the walls that do not resemble known Native American rock art traditions, but that do have structural similarities to the symbolic systems found at several other anomalous sites around the world. The Appalachian findings are not as dramatically anomalous as the Australian tunnels. They are more ambiguous, the dating is less clear, the markings are less extensive, the physical evidence for artificial construction is less compelling. But they are there. They have been documented by a small number of researchers working outside the mainstream archaeological consensus. And those researchers have noted the similarities to what is being found in Australia, in Turkey, in Peru. The more extensively documented American evidence for pre-Columbian contact with, or at minimum parallel development to, the kinds of sophisticated engineering and symbolic systems that appear in the Australian tunnels comes not from tunnel systems but from above-ground sites. And the most significant of those sites is one that most people have heard of, but few people know the full story of. Cahokia, the great mound city that flourished in the Mississippi River Valley near what is now St. Louis, Missouri, between roughly 1050 and 1350 AD. At its height, Cahokia covered an area of roughly 8 square miles and had a population estimated at somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people. Monk's Mound, the largest earthwork in North America, rises to a height of 30 meters and covers more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Cahokia was, at the time of its peak, one of the largest cities in the world. But Cahokia is not just remarkable for its scale, it is remarkable for the evidence it contains of knowledge and organizational capacity that the standard model of North American prehistory cannot adequately account for. The astronomical alignments of the major structures, the evidence of long-distance trade networks connecting Cahokia with communities thousands of kilometers away, the complexity of the social hierarchy suggested by the burial evidence, the precision of the mound construction, which required moving and placing enormous quantities of material in ways that demanded sustained, coordinated labor under sophisticated management. None of this fits with the picture of pre-Columbian North America that most people carry in their heads. The picture of small tribes living in close relationship with the land, moving with the seasons, building temporary structures, leaving light marks on the landscape. Cahokia is the opposite of that picture. It is a permanent city of industrial scale built by a society with a degree of organizational complexity that rivals the contemporaneous civilizations of the Old World. And yet it is explained in the standard archaeological literature as an independent development, as something that arose from within the trajectory of Mississippian culture without outside stimulus, without connection to the complex civilizations developing on the other side of either ocean. The researchers who challenge that explanation have produced a significant body of evidence for pre-Columbian contact between the Americas and cultures from across the Pacific and Atlantic. The evidence includes botanical traces, the presence in pre-Columbian American archaeological contexts of plant species that were native to Asia or Africa and that could not have reached the Americas without human transport. It includes genetic studies showing connections between certain American indigenous populations and populations from Southeast Asia and even from the Pacific Islands that are difficult to explain by the Beringia migration model alone. It includes the analysis of certain symbolic and technological practices shared between pre-Columbian American cultures and cultures from the Old World that appear too specific and too unusual to be the product of independent invention. The most controversial piece of evidence in this category, the one that has generated the most intense debate and the most determined institutional resistance, is what some researchers have called the oceanic connection. The proposition that the Pacific Ocean, far from being a barrier to pre-Columbian contact between the Americas and the rest of the world, was in fact a highway. That people were navigating between Asia, Australia, and the Americas across the Pacific at dates far earlier than the standard model of maritime prehistory allows. The evidence for this proposition is fragmentary, but it is not trivial. The sweet potato, a plant native to South America, was present in Polynesia by at least 1000 AD, several centuries before European contact. The mechanism of its transportation across the Pacific is disputed, but the genetic evidence strongly suggests human agency rather than natural dispersal. Chicken bones found at a pre-Columbian site in Chile have been dated to before 1400 AD and have genetic characteristics that match Polynesian chicken lineages rather than European ones. Cocaine and tobacco, plants of American origin, have been found in trace form in Egyptian mummies dating to over 3,000 years ago. These individual findings are each subject to challenge. Each one has been disputed and disputed again in the scientific literature. But the pattern they form, a consistent suggestion of transoceanic contact at dates that predate Columbus by centuries, decades, or millennia, is harder to dismiss than any individual data point. And when you add that oceanic connection to the picture provided by the Australian tunnels, something important happens. The connection between Australia and the Americas stops being speculative and starts looking like a route, a specific pathway along which something, whether knowledge or people or objects or all three, could have traveled in the deep past. The route in question would run across the South Pacific, the most formidable expanse of open water on Earth. 20,000 kilometers of ocean separating eastern Australia from the western coast of South America. A crossing that no known pre-Columbian culture is supposed to have made. A crossing that, if it was made, required a level of maritime technology and navigational knowledge that the standard model of prehistoric humanity does not assign to any culture in the time period relevant to the tunnel construction, unless the tunnel builders, whoever they were, had that technology. Unless the evidence of engineering sophistication in the tunnel system, the evidence of materials science and precision construction and intentional permanence, was accompanied by evidence of maritime capability that has simply not yet been recovered because the ocean destroys wooden boats more efficiently than bedrock destroys stone passages. The connection between Australia and the Americas through the Pacific is not a proven fact. It is a hypothesis. A hypothesis supported by a growing body of indirect evidence, several pieces of which are genuinely compelling, but not yet by the kind of direct, unambiguous, independently verifiable physical evidence that science requires before revising its fundamental assumptions. But here's the thing about hypotheses in science. They drive research. They define the questions that researchers choose to ask. They determine where people look for evidence and what they are prepared to recognize as evidence when they find it. The hypothesis of a deep Pacific connection between Australia and the Americas has, until very recently, been dismissed by mainstream archaeology so thoroughly that almost nobody in the field has been looking for evidence of it. Almost nobody has been designing studies to test it, asking questions that would produce data relevant to evaluating it, or thinking about what such evidence might look like if it existed. That is starting to change. The genetic revolution in archaeology, the ability to extract and analyze ancient DNA from archaeological samples with increasing precision and decreasing cost, has opened up questions about population history and contact that were simply not answerable with the previous generation of methods. And some of the answers coming back from the ancient DNA work are surprising people who thought they knew the history of human population movement. Indigenous Australian populations carry genetic signatures that, when analyzed against global databases, show connections to South American indigenous populations that cannot be explained by the standard migration routes. The connection is not close. It is not like finding that two neighboring populations share a recent common ancestor. It is more like finding, buried deep in the statistical noise of genetic comparison, a faint signal that says these two populations, separated by the world's largest ocean, are somewhat more similar to each other than chance alone would predict. Faint signals in genetics are not conclusions. They are starting points for further investigation. But the further investigation, in this case, keeps finding more signals rather than washing them out. The signal's there, it is consistently there. And it is pointing in the same direction that the tunnel researchers, the linguists, and the researchers studying pre-Columbian American anomalies have been independently pointing for decades. The direction is toward a past more complex, more connected, and more ancient than the models that currently organize our understanding of human prehistory. The direction is toward a world in which the civilizational isolation that the standard model assumes, in which each of the great human cultural traditions develops separately and independently in its own geographic region, is a simplification that loses something crucial about how the deep history of our species actually unfolded. The direction is toward the possibility, the very real and evidence-supported possibility, that there was a time when knowledge and people and the objects that embody sophisticated understanding moved across the surface of this planet in ways that we have not yet documented and do not yet understand. A time that predates the great civilizations of the historical record. A time that may, if the dating evidence from the Australian tunnels is correct, predate modern human civilization by a margin that should produce humility in everyone who has been confident about what the boundaries of the human story actually are. Let's talk now about what happened to the researchers who took that direction seriously. Because the institutional response to the Australian tunnel findings and to the broader pattern of anomalous evidence that connects Australia to the wider world of forbidden archaeology is itself part of the story. And it is a part that says something important about how knowledge is managed in our civilization, about what gets studied and what gets buried, and about why the full implications of discoveries like the South Australian tunnel system have not yet entered the public conversation in the way that their significance demands. Dr. Raylene Sparks, the geologist who first formally documented the tunnels, had a respectable but unremarkable career trajectory before her 1997 survey expedition. She was known in her field as a careful and methodical researcher. She published regularly in peer-reviewed journals. She had a solid institutional position at a major Australian university and reasonable research funding from the standard grant-making bodies. She was, in other words, a normal member of the scientific establishment in good standing. After the tunnel findings became known within the relevant research communities, her career trajectory changed, not dramatically, not in ways that could be described as an obvious and deliberate attack on her professional standing, but in the subtle, diffuse, and almost impossible to formally document ways that academic institutions use when they want to marginalize a researcher without providing grounds for grievance. Her grant applications began receiving consistently negative reviews from anonymous referees, whose critiques she found, when she was able to examine them, to focus less on the quality of her methods than on the appropriateness of her research questions. The phrase outside the productive mainstream appeared in several rejection letters. Her invitations to conference panels dried up. Younger researchers in her department who had expressed interest in following up the tunnel work found themselves steered, with varying degrees of subtlety, toward other research questions by advisors who had been spoken to by people whose identities were never made clear. None of this is unusual in academia. Every field has its orthodoxies and its mechanisms for protecting them. Every researcher who challenges a fundamental assumption of their discipline faces resistance from the institutional structures that have been built around that assumption. This is normal. This is, in a cynical sense, how science protects the investments it has made in existing theories. But the resistance to the tunnel research went beyond normal scientific conservatism in ways that several of the researchers involved have described as qualitatively different from anything they had encountered before. The missing objects, the chain of custody gap in the artifact documentation, the specific and unusually rapid disappearance of certain research materials from institutional archives that should have preserved them. These are not the behaviors of a scientific establishment protecting a theory. They are the behaviors of something else, something more deliberate. What that something else is, who precisely the actors are, what their motivations might be, is territory where the evidence thins out and speculation begins to take over. The researchers who have been most directly affected by the institutional response to the tunnel findings have their opinions. Some of those opinions implicate specific government agencies whose involvement in the management of Australian archaeological heritage has been criticised on other grounds as well. Some of those opinions implicate international bodies whose connection to Australian archaeology would not be obvious from their public mandates. And some of those opinions implicate dynamics within the academic funding system that are not specific to this case, but that systematically disadvantage research that challenges fundamental assumptions in ways that make established institutions uncomfortable. The honest answer is that the specific mechanisms by which the Australian tunnel findings have been managed and minimized are not fully understood. What is understood, what is documented in the paper trail that still exists despite the missing objects and the archive gaps, is that the findings were extraordinary, that they deserved far more sustained and rigorous follow-up investigation than they received, and that the investigation was curtailed in ways that do not reflect a straightforward application of scientific standards. That curtailment has not stopped the research. It has slowed it, it has fragmented it, distributing it across a number of researchers working in different disciplines who have not always been able to communicate effectively with each other. It has kept the findings from achieving the mainstream visibility that would have attracted the resources and the institutional support that a discovery of this scale requires. But it has not stopped the questions from being asked, and it has not prevented the gradual accumulation of evidence that is building, slowly, and sometimes painfully, toward the point where the full picture can be presented in a form that the mainstream cannot continue to ignore. That point has not yet been reached, but the trajectory of the evidence suggests it is approaching. The ancient DNA work is producing results that will eventually demand explanation. The comparative linguistic analysis is building a cross-cultural framework that will eventually be too detailed to dismiss. The ground sensing technologies that are becoming available for non-invasive study of the tunnel system are producing data sets that will eventually provide an overview of the full extent of the network in a form that no single piece of disputed fieldwork can rebut. And the researchers, scattered across disciplines and institutions, but increasingly aware of each other, are building the collaborative relationships that will eventually produce the kind of comprehensive, cross-verified, multiply-replicated research program that this discovery deserves. When that research program produces its results, when the full picture is assembled and presented with the evidential weight it carries, the conversation about the Australian tunnels will change. Not the tunnels themselves, which have been waiting patiently in the dark for a very long time, and can presumably wait a little longer, but the conversation about what they mean, about what they tell us, about the implications of their existence for everything we think we know about the human past. That conversation is the one we have been building toward in this telling of the story, and it is the one that we will begin to complete now, not with certainty, because certainty is not what the evidence supports, but with the honest assessment of where the evidence points and what it asks us to consider. The evidence asks us to consider that human civilization, as we understand that term, is older and stranger than the consensus account allows, not older by a few thousand years, in ways that would require only minor adjustments to the existing timeline. Older by tens of thousands of years, old enough that the civilizations of ancient Egypt and Sumer, which we have been treating as the beginning of the organized human story, are in fact episodes in the middle of a much longer narrative whose opening chapters were written in places and by means that we have barely begun to understand. The evidence asks us to consider that the transmission of sophisticated knowledge across the surface of this planet, what we might call the global spread of civilization, did not begin with the Silk Road or with Greek and Roman maritime trade or with the European age of exploration. It began much earlier, at a time when the mechanisms of that transmission were different from what we are used to thinking about, when the connections were not between states and empires and trading cities, but between smaller, more mobile, perhaps more fundamentally capable human communities who understood things about navigation, about materials, about the structure of the earth beneath their feet that we are only beginning to recover the ability to recognize. The evidence asks us to consider that Australia, the continent we have been treating as the most isolated and the most peripheral to the main story of human development, is in fact central to that story. Central not in the sense that the most important events of human history happened there, but in the sense that Australia's geological antiquity, the extreme age of its bedrock, and the extreme preservation quality that that antiquity implies, makes it the best place on Earth to find evidence of what happened before the civilizations we know. The tunnels are there not because their builders were Australian in any meaningful cultural sense. They are there because the Australian rock was the best place to build something that needed to last. The evidence asks us to consider that the Aboriginal Australians, whose cultural traditions have preserved memories of the underground places over a period of time that dwarfs all of recorded history, are not simply the surviving representatives of an ancient and isolated tradition. They are also the custodians of a living record that connects the deep pre-human past to the human present. Their knowledge of the tunnels, encoded in language and ritual and cosmological framework, is not superstition. It is memory. It is the most persistent and most faithful form of memory that the human species has ever developed, and it deserves to be treated with the seriousness that its antiquity and its content demand. The evidence asks us to consider that the orthodox narrative of human prehistory, the narrative that we teach in schools and universities, and that underpins the way that museums are organized and documentary films are structured, is a simplification that has become, in certain crucial respects, a distortion. Not a deliberate lie, not a conspiracy in the simple-minded sense of that word, but a distortion produced by the normal processes of institutional conservatism, by the natural tendency of human beings to protect the frameworks that have organized their understanding of the world, and by the specific dynamics of how archaeological evidence is collected, analyzed, interpreted, and communicated. A distortion that has made it possible for extraordinary findings to be collected and then quietly managed into irrelevance, not through malice, but through the operation of systems that were not designed to accommodate discoveries that challenge their fundamental assumptions. And the evidence asks us to consider that this matters, not as an interesting academic question, not as a puzzle for specialists to argue about at conferences. It matters in the way that all fundamental questions about the human past matter, which is that they tell us something about what we are and what we are capable of. They tell us about the scale of the human story. They tell us whether we are newcomers to the project of building complex, sophisticated, organized ways of living together on this planet, or whether that project is much older than we have been given to understand, and whether the catastrophes and collapses that have punctuated that project in the past have been more severe and more complete than the historical record, with its selective preservation of only the most recent episodes, allows us to see. Because if the tunnels are what the evidence suggests they are, if they represent the remains of a civilization or a knowledge tradition that was operating at a level of sophistication comparable to what we mean by civilization in the modern sense, at a date 50,000 years ago or more, then something happened to that civilization. Something ended it. Something ended it so completely that it left almost no trace on the surface of the earth. Something left only the tunnels, buried in the deepest rock of the most ancient continent, as a record that such a thing had existed. What that something was is the final question of this story, and it is a question that takes us into territory that intersects with a surprising range of evidence from fields that seem, on the surface to have nothing to do with underground passages in South Australia. The geological record of the Earth contains evidence of multiple events in the deep past that were severe enough to reset the surface conditions of the planet on a global scale. Events involving asteroid impacts, like the one 66 million years ago that ended the reign of the non-avian dinosaurs. Events involving volcanic episodes so prolonged and so extensive that they changed the composition of the atmosphere and the chemistry of the oceans. Events involving rapid changes in the magnetic field of the planet that reversed the polarity of the geomagnetic field on timescales that, by geological standards, were extremely rapid. And events whose causes are still debated, like the Younger Dryas, the rapid climate reversal that occurred between 13,000 and 11,000 years ago, dropping global temperatures back to near glacial levels after a period of warming, and then ending almost as abruptly as it had begun. The Younger Dryas is particularly relevant to the question of what might have ended a civilization that was operating in the deep past. It was severe enough and rapid enough and geographically widespread enough to have catastrophically disrupted any organized human society that was present on the surface of the Earth when it struck. It was accompanied, according to the physical evidence in ice cores and sediment records, by a significant increase in cosmic dust and specific types of platinum group metal particles that some researchers have interpreted as evidence of an extraterrestrial impact event. An impact that did not produce a single large crater, because the impacting body may have been a comet or a fragmented asteroid that broke up before reaching the surface, but that distributed enough energy and material across the upper atmosphere to produce global effects severe enough to destroy civilizations. The cosmic impact hypothesis for the Younger Dryas remains controversial. It is supported by a growing body of physical evidence, and the number of researchers willing to take it seriously has increased substantially over the last decade as the evidence base has expanded, but it has not yet achieved consensus status. The alternative explanations for the Younger Dryas, involving disruptions to the ocean circulation system rather than cosmic events, are still defended by a significant portion of the relevant research community. What is less controversial is the effect of the Younger Dryas on human populations. The genetic evidence for human population dynamics during this period shows a severe bottleneck in certain populations, a dramatic reduction in effective population size that is consistent with the experience of catastrophic conditions. Multiple civilizations that were present on the surface of the Earth before the Younger Dryas, if there were any at the level of sophistication suggested by the Australian tunnels, would have had their surface expressions destroyed. Their cities, their roads, their above-ground structures, whatever forms those took, would have been covered by ice or buried by sediment or eroded away by the extremely harsh conditions of the Younger Dryas itself and the dramatic sea level rise that followed its end as the glaciers melted. What would survive, what the builders of those civilizations would have known would survive, is what they built to be permanent. Built underground, in the hardest rock, designed to maintain its structural integrity through whatever conditions the surface world experienced. Built to be found by whoever came after, whenever they came, however long that took. The tunnels survived the Younger Dryas. They survived everything that has happened on the surface of this planet since they were built. They are still there. And the people who have gone into them and come back with photographs and measurements and samples and the memory of what it felt like to stand in a passage that had been in darkness for longer than anatomically modern human beings have existed on this planet. Those people are carrying something back with them that is bigger than a scientific finding. They are carrying back evidence that we have predecessors. That the human story does not begin with the cradle of civilization in the Fertile Crescent, or with the emergence of Homo sapiens in Africa, or even with the first members of the genus Homo who learned to chip flint and carry fire across a landscape. The story goes deeper than that. There was something before, something that understood time and built for it, something that knew what it was leaving behind and why, what that something was in relation to us. Whether it was human in a sense that we would recognize, whether it was related to us genetically or culturally, or only in the most general sense of being a form of organized intelligence that operated on this planet, is a question that the current evidence does not yet answer. But it is a question that the tunnels themselves are asking. It is, perhaps, the question they were built to make us ask. In the Aboriginal traditions of Australia, in the deep linguistic memories that Dr. Caldwell's research helped to access, there is a concept that has been translated into English, imperfectly and inadequately, as the law of the long beginning. It is a concept about time, about the relationship between what exists now and what existed before. about the way that the deep past is not simply an absence preceding the present, but is an active presence within it, a foundation, a ground, something that continues to support everything that stands on it, even when the surface layer has forgotten that the foundation is there. The tunnels are the law of the long beginning made physical. They are the ground beneath the ground. They are the past that has not ended, preserved in rock that is older than life, waiting for the questions that would let them speak. The researchers who have been working toward those questions, whose professional lives have been complicated and in some cases damaged by their willingness to take the tunnels seriously, deserve to be known. Their names and their work deserve to be part of the record. And the record deserves to be told in a way that honors the magnitude of what they found, what it cost them to find it, and what it means for all of us that it was there to be found. This is that record, incomplete, provisional, built on evidence that is strong in some places and thin in others, full of questions that have not been answered and that may not be answerable with the tools and the access and the institutional support that has been available. But honest as the evidence allows, as honest as the people who gathered that evidence were in their own assessment of what they had found. The tunnels are there, the markings are there, the objects that were recovered and then disappeared were real. The dating results are what they are. The linguistic evidence is what it is. The genetic signals are what they are. The pattern across multiple continents and multiple research traditions is what it is. Something extraordinary happened in the deep past. We are only beginning to understand what. But the fact that we are beginning is itself significant. The beginning of understanding is always the beginning of responsibility. The responsibility to follow the evidence where it leads. The responsibility to ask the questions that the evidence demands. And the responsibility to hold open, with honesty and with patience, the space for answers that may take a very long time to arrive. The tunnels have been waiting in the dark for a very long time. They can wait a little longer. The question is whether we can. Now, let's go even further into what specific findings from inside the tunnels have connected researchers to the wider pattern of the pre-Columbian world. Because the story of the physical discoveries doesn't stop with the markings and the objects and the dating results. It continues into territory that took some of the researchers involved by complete surprise, territory that they had not expected to enter, territory that opened in front of them as a consequence of following the evidence rather than as the result of any plan or expectation. That territory is the question of what the tunnels were actually used for. Not who built them, not when they were built, but the operational purpose that they served for whoever was using them during the period when they were active. And the evidence that speaks to that question is some of the most arresting in the entire research record. When researchers examined the acoustic properties of the tunnel system in detail, using calibrated sound measurement equipment to map how sound behaved within the passages, they found a pattern of resonance characteristics that was far too specific and too consistent to be accidental. Certain sections of the tunnel system acted as acoustic amplifiers for specific frequencies. Not all frequencies, not a broad range. Specific narrow frequency bands that corresponded to ranges that have significance in human physiology. The frequencies at which certain sections of the tunnel system resonated are the same frequencies that researchers studying ancient ceremonial sites have identified at locations including Newgrange in Ireland, the inner chambers of the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum in Malta, and certain chambers within the ancient temples of Malta that predate the Hypogeum. The same frequencies have been measured in chambers at Palenque in Mexico and in the underground rooms at Tikal in Guatemala. The same frequencies within the measurement precision available in underground spaces scattered across multiple continents, built by cultures that are not supposed to have been in contact with each other, built at times that span thousands of years. The frequency in question is in the range of around 110 Hz, a base resonance that requires a large space with specific reflective properties to sustain. When you're in a space that resonates at this frequency, and a sound is made within the frequency range, the resonance amplifies and sustains the sound in a way that creates an unusual auditory experience. Researchers studying the neurological effects of sustained sound at this frequency have found that it produces measurable changes in brain activity patterns, specifically in the patterns associated with meditative and trance states. It does not require any special susceptibility. It works on normal human brains in the same way that certain light patterns work on normal human visual systems. It is a physical interaction between a sound characteristic and a property of human neurological processing. The presence of this specific acoustic design feature in the Australian tunnels is not something that happened by accident. The shaping of a large underground space to resonate at a specific frequency requires intentional design. It requires knowledge of acoustics. It requires the ability to test the resonance properties of a space under construction and to modify the construction to achieve a desired acoustic result. It requires, in other words, a relationship between builder and acoustic effect that presupposes experimental knowledge of how sound behaves in enclosed spaces and of how that sound interacts with human perception. That kind of knowledge is not primitive. That kind of knowledge represents a sophisticated intersection of physics and human physiology that we would, if we encountered it as a design feature of a building constructed today, describe as advanced acoustic engineering. It was present in the Australian tunnels. It was present in sites on multiple other continents that, according to the standard model of human prehistory, should have had no mechanism for sharing it. And its presence in all of these places, consistently, points towards something that the standard model of cultural transmission cannot account for. A shared tradition of underground architectural practice that included the deliberate design of acoustic properties as a functional feature. Functional for what? If the answer was simply ritual, simply the creation of an impressive sonic environment for ceremonial purposes, that would be interesting, but it would not be extraordinary. Ritual use of resonant spaces is documented across many cultures and many historical periods. The cathedral builders of medieval Europe understood resonance, even if they did not express that understanding in terms of physics. But the specific frequency found in the tunnel system suggests something more targeted than general sonic impressiveness. It suggests the design of spaces that would reliably produce specific neurological effects in human participants. It suggests, in other words, that whoever designed these spaces was not simply creating an impressive environment. They were creating a tool for modifying the state of consciousness of the human beings who entered the space. And the modification they were aiming for, if the neuroscience of the relevant frequency range is a reliable guide, was the modification associated with deep meditative or trance states, with what psychologists now call reduced default mode network activity, with the temporary softening of the boundary between ordinary cognitive processing and other forms of perception and experience. Put plainly, whoever built the Australian tunnels appears to have understood that underground spaces resonating at around 110 Hz would alter the mental state of human beings in ways that made those human beings more receptive to certain kinds of experience. And they built those spaces with the specific design characteristics required to produce that resonance. This is not magic. This is applied neuroscience. Applied neuroscience practiced by builders working 50,000 or more years ago in Australia, and apparently also in Ireland and Malta and Guatemala and wherever else these resonant underground spaces have been found. Applied neuroscience that required a level of understanding of human physiology and of acoustic physics that the standard model of prehistoric cognitive capability does not support. The tunnels keep refusing to be simple. They keep opening into complexity. They keep producing findings that, when taken seriously, make the standard story of who we are and where we came from harder and harder to maintain. That is not a comfortable situation for the scientific establishment. It is not comfortable for the institutions that have built their reputations on the standard story. It is not comfortable for the funding bodies and the government agencies and the academic journals that have organized their operations around the assumption that the standard story is basically correct. Discovering that a fundamental assumption is wrong is never comfortable for the people whose careers and institutions are built around that assumption. But it is exhilarating for the people who follow the evidence. And it is important for all of us, whether we are researchers or simply people who want to understand the world we live in, to have access to the full picture of the human past, the full picture of what was present on this earth before the civilizations we know, the full picture of what the Australian tunnels contain and what they tell us about the deep history of our species. The full picture is still being assembled, but what is already visible in the fragments and the findings and the anomalies and the patterns that this story has tried to present is extraordinary enough. Extraordinary enough to demand continued investigation. Extraordinary enough to demand the kind of sustained, properly resourced, open-minded scientific attention that this discovery has not yet received, but that it unambiguously deserves. The darkness in the tunnels is absolute. 50,000 years of absolute darkness. But the darkness has not erased what is there, it has preserved it. And the light that the researchers have brought into that darkness, however limited and however contested, has been enough to reveal something that will not go back into the dark. The world we live in sits on top of a history much longer and stranger than most of us have been told. The tunnels are proof of that. And the story of what lies in their deepest sections, in the parts that have not yet been opened to any light at all, is a story that is still waiting to be told. The story that is still waiting to be told has a geography. It has specific locations, specific physical coordinates on the surface of the Earth, where the next chapters of the tunnel research are expected to unfold. Some of those locations are in Australia, some are on the other side of the Pacific, in the Americas, some are in between, in the vast middle of the ocean, where no one has yet gone looking with the right questions in mind. Let's start with the Australian locations. The initial survey areas documented by Dr. Sparks and the subsequent research teams are in South Australia, in a region of the outback that is remote enough to have seen very little systematic archaeological investigation by anyone at any time in the history of European Australian science. The ground-penetrating radar surveys that have been conducted over the last decade suggest that the tunnel network extends significantly beyond the areas that have been physically explored. The radar data, which has been analyzed by a team of specialists whose results have circulated within the research community without achieving formal publication, indicates passages and chambers in areas that are currently accessible only by air, that have no road access, and that are in regions where the traditional custodians of the land have indicated the presence of sites of cultural significance that should not be disturbed without appropriate consultation and consent. The process of building the relationships with Aboriginal communities that would allow for respectful and mutually beneficial engagement with those sites is ongoing. It is slow as it should be. The history of European Australian engagement with Aboriginal cultural sites and heritage has been, to put it charitably, marked by a great deal of taking and a great deal less listening. The researchers currently working in this area are aware of that history and are trying to operate differently. They are trying to develop frameworks for collaboration that center Aboriginal knowledge and Aboriginal decision-making authority, rather than treating Aboriginal informants as sources of data to be extracted and processed by outside experts. That approach takes time. It also, in the view of some of the researchers involved, produces better research. Because the knowledge that Aboriginal communities hold about the underground places is not simply contextual information about the locations and the cultural significance of specific sites. It is, as the linguistic analysis and the comparative cosmological work have suggested, a form of technical knowledge. Knowledge about the nature of the underground network, about the relationships between its parts, about what it contains and what it was used for, that has been encoded in cultural tradition precisely because it was considered too important to lose. If that knowledge can be accessed in forms that the communities who hold it are willing to share, in ways that respect the terms on which it has been preserved, then the research program studying the tunnels will have access to something that no amount of drilling and sampling and spectroscopic analysis can provide: the indigenous understanding of what the tunnels are for, not as a scientific hypothesis to be tested against physical data, but as a parallel line of evidence that may, when brought into dialogue with the physical data, help to close the gap between what the data shows and what it means. That gap is currently large. The physical data is extraordinary. The meaning of that data is contested. And the indigenous knowledge tradition may hold exactly the conceptual framework that is needed to make the physical data interpretable in ways that the scientific tradition on its own has not yet been able to achieve. This is not mysticism. It is not an argument for replacing scientific method with traditional knowledge. It is an argument for a more genuinely open-minded and methodologically pluralistic approach to a research problem that has already demonstrated, repeatedly and dramatically, that it exceeds the explanatory capacity of any single discipline or tradition working alone. The North American dimension of this expanded research program is at an earlier stage. The connections that have been identified between the Australian tunnel findings and the anomalous pre-Columbian archaeology of the Americas are still primarily at the level of pattern recognition rather than documented evidence of direct connection. The ancient DNA work is producing relevant data, but interpreting it requires the kind of careful and skeptical analysis that takes time. The comparative symbolic analysis is interesting but not yet conclusive, and the physical exploration of potential tunnel systems in the Appalachians and in other parts of North America is at a very preliminary stage, but the direction is clear. The researchers who are following the evidence are looking for the same features in North American underground systems that they have documented in South Australia: the consistent dimensions, the non-natural surface textures, the specific acoustic properties, the wall markings with the compositional logic of a communication system, rather than the random distribution of natural markings. If those features are present in the Appalachian systems or in other North American underground locations, if they can be documented to a standard that will withstand scientific scrutiny, then the case for a global pattern becomes dramatically stronger. The search for those features is happening. It is happening quietly, without the fanfare that a discovery of this significance deserves, because the researchers doing the searching have learned from the experience of the Australian tunnel investigations and from the history of other anomalous findings in pre-Columbian archaeology that fanfare attracts exactly the kind of institutional attention that tends to curtail rather than advance the research. They are building their evidence base carefully. They are documenting everything. They are creating the kind of record that will survive even if specific physical materials are somehow managed out of the evidentiary chain, the way the Australian objects were managed out of it. The question of when this evidence base will reach the critical mass required to force the mainstream scientific conversation to engage with it seriously is not one that can be answered with precision. Scientific paradigms do not shift on a predictable schedule. They shift when the weight of anomalous evidence becomes too great to absorb within the existing framework, when the researchers who have been working at the edges of the paradigm produce a body of work that is too extensive, too carefully done, and too mutually reinforcing to dismiss, and when the scientists who have been working within the paradigm find that their own results keep running into the anomalies and can no longer pretend not to notice them. All three of those conditions are developing. The body of work is growing. The ancient DNA results are running into the anomalies. The geological surveys are producing data that does not fit the standard model. The acoustic research is producing results that demand explanation. The point of critical mass is approaching, even if the rate of approach is frustratingly slow from the perspective of the researchers who have been working toward it for years. When it arrives, when the scientific conversation about the Australian tunnels opens up in the way that the significance of the findings demands, the conversation will be about more than the tunnels themselves. It will be about the entire framework within which we understand the human past, about the models of cognitive evolution and cultural complexity that determine what kinds of achievements we are willing to attribute to prehistoric people, about the assumptions built into archaeological dating and interpretation that have made it systematically difficult to recognize evidence of sophisticated engineering and organized knowledge building in contexts that predate the standard model's timeline for such developments. It will be a conversation about epistemology, about how we know what we know, about the difference between absence of evidence and evidence of absence, about the institutional dynamics that shape which questions get asked and which findings get taken seriously, about the ways in which the scientific establishment, with all its genuine commitment to truth and its impressive track record of producing reliable knowledge, is also a human institution subject to the same conservative dynamics, the same tendency to protect existing investments, the same discomfort with fundamental revision that characterize human institutions in general. That conversation is overdue, not just for Australian archaeology, for the whole field of human prehistory. The standard model of what people were doing and thinking and building 50,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, further back than that, is built on a combination of genuine evidence and genuine inference and genuine insight, but also on gaps and silences and the absence of evidence from places and periods that have not yet been adequately investigated. The gaps and silences should be generating research programs, not default assumptions. The Australian tunnels are a gap in the standard model that has generated research. That research has produced evidence. That evidence points toward conclusions that are uncomfortable for the standard model. Those conclusions deserve to be taken seriously, argued with carefully, tested against alternative explanations, and ultimately incorporated into a revised understanding of the human past that is more accurate and more complete than what we currently have. That is how science is supposed to work. And the story of the Australian tunnels, with all its complications and controversies and missing objects and institutional resistances, is ultimately a story about science trying to do its job in the face of evidence that makes the job genuinely difficult. The darkness of those tunnels is extraordinary. 50,000 years of darkness, maybe more. But in that darkness, preserved by the hardness of the most ancient rock on Earth, there is evidence of something that was here before us, something that built to last, something that knew it was building for a future it would never see. We are that future. We are the people the tunnels were built for, and we are only beginning to understand what we were left. The story continues. In the ground beneath Australia, in the ancient DNA of populations who live on both sides of the world's largest ocean, in the linguistic memories of people whose ancestors watched the stars and went underground and came back with knowledge they encoded in the deepest structures of language itself. In the frustrated determination of researchers who know what they found and have not yet found the way to make the world listen, the world is starting to listen, slowly, with the difficulty that always attends the revision of fundamental assumptions. But the tunnels are patient, they have been waiting a very long time, and what they have been waiting to tell us is worth the wait. Now, let's turn to what happens when you take all of this, the physical tunnels and the markings and the acoustic engineering and the Aboriginal linguistic memories and the pre-Columbian American anomalies and the genetic signals across the Pacific, and you ask the question that all of it is pointing toward, not as a conspiracy theory, not as a sensational claim about ancient aliens or lost continents, though those frameworks have latched onto the edges of this research because the research opens territory that those frameworks have been staking claims to for decades, as a scientific question, asked with full awareness of the limits of the evidence and the genuine difficulty of what is being proposed. The question is this: was there, in the deep past, a phase of organized human civilization that was sophisticated enough to build the Australian tunnels, that extended its reach across the Pacific in ways that left genetic and cultural traces in the pre-Columbian Americas, that encoded its knowledge in physical structures designed to survive indefinitely, and that ended completely enough to leave almost no above-ground trace in a catastrophic event that the geological record preserves evidence of, but that the historical record, beginning as it does far too late, cannot speak to directly? The honest scientific answer is that the evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The physical tunnel evidence is real and anomalous. The genetic signals are real and anomalous. The linguistic evidence is real and suggestive. The acoustic engineering is real and remarkable. The pre-Columbian American connections are real and contested. None of this adds up, individually or together, to a proof. None of it is the kind of evidence that compels scientific consensus in the way that, say, the evidence for plate tectonics compelled consensus, or the evidence for the structure of DNA, or the evidence for the cosmic origins of the chemical elements. But it is evidence, real evidence, carefully gathered evidence. Evidence that has been examined by competent researchers and found to be genuine rather than fabricated or mistaken. And evidence that refuses, despite the institutional pressure to do so, to go away or to become less anomalous as more of it accumulates. The appropriate response to that situation is not to accept the most dramatic interpretation and declare the question answered. And it is not to dismiss the evidence as unimportant because it is inconvenient. The appropriate response is to invest in the research that would allow the question to be answered more definitively, to build the collaborative relationships between scientists and between scientific researchers and indigenous knowledge holders that would allow the full range of available evidence to be brought to bear on the question, to develop the methods and tools that would allow the inaccessible sections of the tunnel system to be studied non-invasively, to support the ancient DNA work and the comparative linguistic analysis and the acoustic research and the geological surveys that are together building toward the comprehensive picture that this mystery deserves. That investment has not yet been made at the scale required, but it will be, not because the people in power have decided that the tunnels are important, but because the evidence is too compelling and too carefully documented to remain invisible indefinitely. The story has momentum. The researchers who are telling it are doing so with increasing skill and with an increasing awareness of what they are dealing with and of how to present their findings in ways that the scientific establishment cannot easily dismiss. The Australian tunnels are not going anywhere. They have been there for 50,000 years. They will be there for whatever comes next. And the question of what they tell us about ourselves and about our predecessors on this remarkable planet is a question that deserves all the seriousness and all the sustained attention that the scientific community at its best is capable of bringing to bear. That attention is gathering, slowly, imperfectly, against resistance that has sometimes been fierce and sometimes been subtle and is always somewhat dispiriting for the people doing the work. But gathering nonetheless. The darkness in the tunnels is absolute. But absolute darkness, when you have a light, is not an obstacle. It is a revelation. Every meter of tunnel that has been documented, every marking that has been photographed, every sample that has been dated, every acoustic measurement that has been taken, every molecule of ancient organic material that has been analyzed, is a step further into that darkness with a light in your hand. A step further toward understanding what was there before us and what it left behind. What it left behind is extraordinary. What understanding it fully will require of us is patience, intellectual courage, and the kind of open-minded rigor that the best science brings to the hardest questions. The tunnels are the hardest question, and the beginning of the answer is already visible in the light that the researchers have brought into the darkness over the last 3 decades. The rest of the answer is still down there, waiting in the oldest rock of the oldest continent, in the absolute dark of 50,000 years of silence. And somewhere in that silence, if the evidence is pointing where it seems to be pointing, is the record of a chapter in the human story that we forgot. A chapter that is only now beginning to be remembered. The act of remembering is not passive. It is not simply a matter of information returning to consciousness, the way a dream sometimes returns to you in the middle of the afternoon with unexpected clarity. Remembering in the sense that matters here is an active process. It requires the tools of inquiry. It requires the willingness to question what you thought you knew. It requires the patience to sit with uncertainty for as long as uncertainty is the honest answer. And it requires, more than anything else, the recognition that the past is not behind us, but beneath us, in the literal as well as the metaphorical sense. It is in the ground, it is in the rock, it is in the dark below the surface of the world we move through, and it is accessible if we are willing to go down and look. The researchers who went down and looked in South Australia in the 1990s and the 2000s and the years since have not been adequately celebrated or adequately supported. Their work has been contested, minimized, and in some specific instances actively impeded in ways that remain troubling and incompletely explained. But they went down anyway. They looked, they brought back what they found, and what they found is part of the record now, in a way that cannot be entirely undone even by the institutional pressures that have tried to manage it into irrelevance. The record says this: there are tunnels beneath Australia. They are ancient beyond the parameters of the standard historical model. They contain evidence of intelligent design. They contain evidence of a symbolic system of considerable complexity. They contain evidence of manufacturing capability that exceeds what any known prehistoric human society is supposed to have possessed. They have acoustic properties that require deliberate engineering to produce. They show structural preservation characteristics that indicate an intention of extraordinary permanence, and the Aboriginal Australian cultural traditions that have been maintained in the landscape above them for at least 65,000 years, carrying coded memories of the underground places that are consistent in their deep structure with what the physical evidence shows those places to be. The record also says that these tunnels do not exist in isolation, that similar anomalous underground findings have been documented on multiple other continents, that the pattern of evidence for ancient transoceanic connection between Australia and the Americas is growing rather than diminishing as new analytical methods are applied to existing data, and new data is gathered from newly examined sites. That the institutional response to all of this evidence has been characterized by a degree of resistance that is disproportionate to the quality of the evidence, and that invites questions about the motivations behind that resistance. The record says, in other words, that the question of what lies beneath Australia is not a curiosity at the edges of respectable inquiry. It is a serious scientific question that has generated serious evidence and that deserves serious sustained engagement from the full range of disciplines that can bring relevant expertise to bear on it. And the failure to provide that engagement is not a reflection of the quality of the evidence. It is a reflection of something else. Something about institutions, something about consensus, something about the deeply human difficulty of revising a story that has been told for so long and in so many contexts that it has stopped feeling like a story and started feeling like the world. The world beneath the story is what the tunnels are showing us, the older world, the deeper world, the world that existed before the story we have been telling started, and that is evidently far more complex and far more interesting than the story allows. We have been telling ourselves a story about the human past in which we are the most sophisticated beings who have ever lived on this planet, in which the arc of human history is one of progressive development from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced, from ignorant to knowing, in which the people who came before us were less capable, less organized, less technologically sophisticated than we are, and in which the evidence of their lives reflects those limitations faithfully and completely. The Australian tunnels challenge that story at its foundation. They suggest that the arc is not progressive in the simple sense we have assumed, that there were capable and sophisticated intelligences operating on this earth at times so remote that our current models of human cognitive evolution do not provide for them, that the story of the human past is not a single ascending line, but something more complicated, Perhaps a series of ascending lines, some of which reach significant heights before being interrupted, leaving behind not the above-ground ruins that we usually look for, but the underground records that the geologically ancient rock of this planet is capable of preserving through whatever happens to the surface. That is a story with different implications than the one we have been telling. It is a story in which the loss of knowledge is real, in which catastrophic interruption of civilizational trajectories is a real possibility, in which the progress that we have made is genuinely precarious in a way that the standard progressive narrative does not prepare us to recognize. But it is also a story in which the possibility of finding, in the deep past, evidence of what has been lost is real, in which the ground literally contains things that we thought were gone forever, in which the act of inquiry directed at the deep past is not merely academic, but has the character of recovery, recovery of what was lost, recovery of knowledge, recovery of a more complete and accurate understanding of the human story, recovery of the capacity to be genuinely humble about what we know and genuinely curious about what we don't. Recovery of the awareness that the civilization we have built is not the first attempt at something like this on this planet, and that the failures of previous attempts contain information that is relevant to our own situation in ways that we have not yet adequately explored. The tunnels are the beginning of that recovery, not the end, not the complete picture, the beginning. The first few pages of a chapter whose length and content we cannot yet see because we have barely opened the cover. The researchers who opened the cover are the heroes of this story, not in a simple or sentimental sense, in the sense that doing difficult and important work in the face of institutional resistance and professional cost and genuine uncertainty about whether any of it will matter is heroic in the specific and meaningful way that the word was originally meant to describe. They went into the dark, they came back with light, and the light they brought back is still shining, still illuminating, still pushing back the darkness a little further with every additional study and every additional finding, and every additional researcher who reads the record and decides that the question is worth pursuing. The question is worth pursuing. The tunnels are worth understanding. The full story of what lies beneath Australia, what it connects to, what it tells us about the deep past, and the full scope of the human story, is worth every bit of the sustained, careful, open-minded, interdisciplinary, and culturally respectful inquiry that it will require to answer it properly. And that inquiry is ongoing. Right now, somewhere in the outback of South Australia, ground sensing equipment is producing data that will be analysed and argued over and compared against the existing record. Somewhere in a university linguistics department, a researcher is tracing the distribution of underground associated semantic fields across language groups that have never previously been compared. Somewhere in a genetics laboratory, ancient DNA from an archaeological sample that nobody expected to be relevant to this story is being sequenced and compared against reference populations from across the Pacific. Somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, somebody with a flashlight and a measuring tape and a notebook is crawling through a passage in hard rock that maintains a consistent diameter for a distance that natural erosion processes cannot account for. The inquiry is ongoing. The evidence is accumulating. The picture is slowly, painfully, magnificently becoming clearer. The tunnels are there. They are waiting, and what they have been preserving in the darkness for longer than modern human civilization has existed on this planet is something worth knowing. The question of what exactly that is remains, for now, one of the most beautiful and most important unanswered questions in the history of human inquiry. The question of where the answer to that question will take us, once we have the tools and the courage and the institutional support to properly pursue it, may turn out to be the most important journey of the next century of human knowledge. That journey has already begun, in the tunnels beneath South Australia, in the ancient DNA laboratories and the linguistics departments and the remote sensing surveys and the quiet conversations between researchers who have been sitting with the evidence long enough to understand what it is asking. It has begun, and where it ends we cannot yet see, but the beginning is extraordinary, and extraordinary is enough, for now, to keep going. Let's go a little deeper into what the Aboriginal Australian traditions specifically record about the beings or presences associated with the underground places. This is territory where the distinction between myth and memory becomes blurry in productive ways, where the cultural materials encode information that cannot be fully disentangled from the cosmological framework within which they have been preserved, but that points repeatedly and consistently towards something that the physical evidence in the tunnels appears to corroborate. The Aboriginal traditions across multiple language groups use a cluster of terms that linguists working in this area have translated, with varying degrees of confidence and with acknowledgement of the inevitable inadequacy of English as a vehicle for these concepts, as the ones below, or the old ones in the ground, or the deep keepers. These terms appear in ceremonial contexts, in the restricted knowledge traditions that are passed within specific cultural roles rather than shared openly with the general community, and in certain of the story complexes associated with the dreaming that deal with the creation of the physical structure of the landscape, particularly with the creation of underground features. The deep keepers are not simply a category of spirit being in the sense that animistic traditions often populate the natural world with spiritual presences. They are specifically associated with knowledge, with the transmission of knowledge, with the idea that certain kinds of understanding can only be received in specific underground locations, in states of consciousness that are not ordinary waking consciousness, through some form of encounter that the traditions describe in various ways, but that consistently involves going down and being given something to bring back up. What is brought back up varies in different traditions and in different ceremonial contexts. Sometimes it is described as a design, a pattern, a marking that the recipient is then responsible for maintaining or replicating in the physical world. Sometimes it is described as a song, a sequence of sounds and rhythms that encode specific information about the landscape or about practices necessary for maintaining the conditions on which life depends. Sometimes it is described in more abstract terms, as an understanding of relationships, of the connections between things that are not visible on the surface, of the invisible infrastructure underlying visible reality. All of these descriptions are compatible with what the physical evidence from the tunnels suggests about their purpose. The markings on the walls could be described as designs that were meant to be encountered, absorbed, and in some sense carried back to the surface. The acoustic properties of the tunnels could be described as a context for the transmission of songs that encode landscape knowledge, and the overall character of the tunnel system as an infrastructure underlying and organizing the surface landscape in ways that are not visible from above is directly described by the abstract formulations of the deep keeper traditions. The consistency between the physical evidence and the cultural memory is remarkable, not because it proves any specific historical claim, not because it provides a definitive answer to the question of who built the tunnels or when or why, but because it suggests that the Aboriginal cultural traditions have been preserving, in encoded form, actual information about actual places over an actual period of time, and that the encoded information, when decoded through the lens of the physical evidence and the linguistic analysis, is more literal and more accurate than the framework of myth versus history would normally allow us to expect. This is what makes the Australian tunnel story uniquely important in the wider context of anomalous archaeology. It is not just a story about physical evidence that does not fit the standard model. It is a story about the relationship between physical evidence and living cultural tradition, about the way that knowledge is encoded and transmitted across timescales that exceed the capacity of written records, about the respect and seriousness that Indigenous knowledge traditions deserve as repositories of genuinely historical information rather than simply as cultural artifacts of ethnographic interest. The argument being made here, by the evidence and by the researchers who have been carefully building the case for taking it seriously, is not simply that the standard model of human prehistory needs revision. It is that the tools we use to understand the human past need expansion. That the collaboration between geological and archaeological science and Indigenous knowledge is not a matter of courtesy or political correctness, but is an epistemological necessity. That the information held in Aboriginal Australian cultural tradition about the underground places is not supplementary to the scientific investigation, but is in certain crucial respects irreplaceable. Without it, the physical evidence from the tunnels is extraordinary but ultimately uninterpretable. With it, the physical evidence becomes part of a coherent, if incomplete, picture of what the tunnels are and what they represent. That coherent picture says, there was something before. There was a civilization, or a knowledge tradition, or an organized intelligence of some kind, that operated on this planet at a level of sophistication that we are only now developing the tools to recognize and the humility to take seriously. It left its most permanent record underground, in the most ancient rock of the most ancient continent. It encoded knowledge in the walls of the passages it built. It designed those passages to produce specific experiential states in the human beings who entered them. And it arranged for those passages to be known about, remembered, and kept meaningful in the cultural traditions of the people who would inhabit the continent above them for tens of thousands of years. That is a plan, a specific, deliberate plan. A plan that says, we know we will not last. We know something is coming that will end what we have built on the surface, but we will put what matters most in the ground, where it will survive whatever comes, and we will ensure that the people who come after will know it is there, even if they do not know what it is. And here we are, knowing it is there, beginning to understand what it is, beginning to understand what it means that it is there, beginning to understand what we owe to the intelligence that put it there, and to the people who kept the memory of it alive for longer than we have been capable of imagining. What we owe them is the full engagement of the best inquiry we can bring to bear. We owe them the courage to follow the evidence wherever it leads. We owe them the honesty to say that we do not yet know what they knew, but that we are trying to find out. And we owe them, in the most fundamental sense, the recognition that the human story is longer and stranger and more magnificent than any account of it that has yet been told. The Australian tunnels are the physical proof of that recognition. They are there, in the dark, in the deep, in the rock that is older than anything else on the surface of this planet. They are waiting for us to understand them. The waiting is not passive. The tunnels, in the sense that the Aboriginal traditions describe and that the physical evidence corroborates, are not simply inert architectural remains. They are a record. A living record in the sense that the information they preserve is genuine and recoverable and meaningful, even after all the time that has passed and all the events that have intervened between the moment of their creation and the moment of our encounter with them. Living records do not wait passively. They accumulate. They build toward interpretation. They push, gently and without agency, but with the irresistible logic of evidence, toward understanding. The understanding toward which all of this is building is not yet fully visible, but its outlines are there, in the evidence and in the cultural memory and in the pattern that connects Australia to the Americas, and the Americas to the rest of the world's anomalous archaeology. Its outlines are there in the work of the researchers who have been doing this against the odds and in spite of the resistance. Its outlines are there in the ancient DNA data and in the linguistic analysis and in the acoustic measurements and in the dating results that keep refusing to fit the standard model's expectations. The understanding is coming, not all at once, not in the form of a single dramatic revelation that settles all the questions, but piece by piece, finding by finding, conversation by conversation, in the slow and sometimes agonizing way that fundamental revisions to fundamental assumptions always arrive. And when it arrives fully, when the picture is complete enough to be presented in a form that the mainstream scientific world and the wider public can engage with properly, it will be one of the most important moments in the history of human knowledge. Not because it will resolve all the mysteries of the human past, it will open more mysteries than it closes, but because it will fundamentally change the question we are asking. It will shift the question from what we are to what we come from who we are now to who we were before, from the story we have been telling about ourselves to the deeper story that the evidence is telling about us. That deeper story is what the tunnels contain. That is what is in the dark beneath Australia. That is what has been preserved in the hardest rock of the oldest continent, in absolute darkness, for longer than modern human civilization has existed. That is what the scientists found in Australia's most mysterious tunnels. And what they found has shocked the world, because the world was not expecting to discover that it had a past so much longer, so much richer, and so much more complex than the past it thought it knew. The shock is appropriate. The past is extraordinary. And the inquiry is ongoing. The tunnels are still there, in the dark, in the deep, waiting for us to understand what they are trying to tell us. We are beginning to listen. There is a specific quality to the silence inside the Australian tunnels that every researcher who has spent time in them has tried, with varying degrees of success, to describe. It is not simply the absence of sound. It is something more active than that. It is a silence that has texture and weight and a quality of sustained intensity that you do not encounter in any other kind of underground space. Not in natural caves where the silence is broken by the drip of water and the occasional rustle of bat wings. Not in human-built tunnels and mines where the smell of concrete and machine oil and disturbed earth reminds you constantly of recent human presence. It is a silence that feels old, that communicates its own age, that makes you feel, in a way that is almost impossible to articulate to someone who has not experienced it, that you are inside time itself, that the walls around you are not just rock but accumulated duration, compressed millennia, the physical substance of time so vast that human language does not have the scale for it. Several of the researchers who have spent time in the tunnels have described a specific experience that occurs after extended periods in this silence. Not a hallucination, not a mystical vision. Something more subtle and more interesting than either of those terms implies. A sense of perspective. A radical alteration in the felt scale of things. The sense that the human span, the lifespan of an individual human being, and the historical span of human civilization is very small relative to the duration encoded in the rock around you, and that this relative smallness is not a diminishment but a liberation. That knowing your actual scale in the system of things, knowing it in the felt and embodied way that the tunnel silence seems to communicate rather than in the abstract intellectual way that statistics and geological timescales produce, is a form of clarity rather than a form of despair. The researchers who have described this experience do so with a certain caution. They are scientists trained to distrust subjective experiences data. They are aware that what they are describing is personal and unverifiable and outside the standard categories of scientific reporting. But they also, almost without exception, describe the experience as important, as having influenced their thinking about the tunnels and about the questions the tunnels ask in ways that they cannot fully separate from the technical findings, as if the silence itself were part of the information, as if the scale that the silence communicates were the context within which the physical findings need to be understood. This is not mysticism, it is phenomenology. It is the acknowledgement that human understanding is not purely cognitive, that the embodied experience of being in a specific place at a specific moment contributes to the understanding of that place in ways that purely instrumental analysis does not fully capture. It is the recognition that the people who designed the tunnels, who selected this rock and these dimensions and these acoustic properties and these locations for the markings, understood something about the human experience of being underground, that the purely physical analysis of the tunnels recovers only partially. What they understood, apparently, is that knowledge is not only transmitted through explicit communication, through words and diagrams and formal instruction, it is also transmitted through experience. Through the direct encounter with specific conditions that produce specific responses in the human nervous system, through the kind of understanding that comes not from reading about a thing, but from being in the presence of it, in a state of heightened attention and reduced cognitive noise, for long enough to let it register at levels deeper than the verbal. The tunnel silence produces that state. The acoustic resonance at specific frequencies produces that state. The scale and the darkness and the textures of the walls and the quality of the air in the oldest sections, all of it together, produces a condition of perception that is different from ordinary waking consciousness, in ways that have been documented by researchers using portable EEG equipment during their underground work. The specific EEG signatures that researchers have recorded in themselves and in colleagues while in the tunnels are the signatures associated with increased theta wave activity, a brain state that neuroscience associates with creative insight, with pattern recognition across disparate information, with the kind of understanding that comes not from linear reasoning, but from the holistic processing that the brain does when the noise of ordinary sensory input is reduced. Theta states, in the language of contemporary neuroscience, are states of enhanced neural integration, states in which the brain brings together information from different processing streams in ways that are not available during ordinary waking consciousness, states in which the barrier between what is known consciously and what is known below the level of conscious awareness becomes more permeable, states in which pattern recognition extends across a wider range of input than ordinary consciousness can manage. The ancient Greeks called these states states of divine inspiration. The Aboriginal Australians call them, in the relevant ceremonial traditions, being in country. Many cultures from around the world have specific terms and specific practices for achieving these states, recognizing their value for certain kinds of knowing, building ritual and ceremonial structures around the conditions that produce them. The common element across all of these traditions is the recognition that ordinary consciousness is not the only mode of human understanding, and is not sufficient for all the kinds of knowing that human beings need to do. The Australian tunnels appear to have been designed with an understanding of this, that expressed itself in architecture. In the deliberate construction of spaces whose physical characteristics, from the acoustic resonance to the scale to the quality of the silence, produce conditions that enhance the specific brain states associated with integrated, holistic, pattern-recognizing understanding. Spaces that were not merely shelters or storage facilities or ritual settings in the conventional sense, but cognitive environments. Environments specifically designed to enhance the capacity of human beings to understand things that are difficult to understand in ordinary conditions. What things? That is the question that the design of the tunnels poses, but does not by itself answer. The markings may be part of the answer. The objects that were recovered before they disappeared may have been part of the answer. The specific distribution and specific characteristics of the acoustic resonance chambers within the tunnel network, which have been documented in enough detail to suggest that different sections of the network were tuned to different frequency ranges and may have been used for different purposes, may be part of the answer. But the full answer is not yet available. It requires access to the sections of the tunnel system that have not yet been explored. It requires the completion of the research programs that are still in progress. It requires the kind of sustained, properly resourced, genuinely open-minded inquiry that this discovery demands, and that has not yet been provided. What is available now is the framework. The understanding that the tunnels are not just anomalous geological features or anomalous archaeological sites. They are an architectural expression of a philosophy of knowledge, a philosophy that understood the human mind as capable of kinds of understanding that require specific conditions to activate, a philosophy that built those conditions into the physical structure of the most permanent spaces it could create, a philosophy that encoded its most important knowledge not in books or tablets or any medium that the passage of time could degrade, but in the configuration of space itself, in the relationships between surfaces and volumes and acoustic properties that can survive as long as the rock survives. That is a philosophy of knowledge that we have never encountered before in our investigations of the human past, not because it is unique to this one site or this one region or this one building tradition. The acoustic chambers at the other sites we have mentioned, in Malta and Turkey and Peru, suggest that this philosophy was not unique to Australia. It suggests that there was a tradition, a shared understanding of how knowledge should be preserved and transmitted, that found expression in underground architectural design across a range of sites and cultures so widespread that accounting for it by independent invention strains credibility. It suggests a connected tradition, a global or nearly global knowledge tradition that understood the underground as a medium, that used the permanence and the acoustic properties and the cognitive effects of underground spaces as tools for the transmission and preservation of essential knowledge. What knowledge? We are back to the same question. We cannot yet answer it with the completeness it deserves, but we can say what kind of knowledge the design of the tunnels seems optimized for transmitting. It is knowledge that requires holistic understanding rather than linear reasoning. Knowledge that is about relationships and patterns rather than isolated facts. Knowledge that benefits from the reduction of ordinary sensory noise and the enhancement of integrated neural processing. Knowledge that is best understood not as a collection of explicit propositions, but as a way of seeing, a way of perceiving the relationships within and between things that are not accessible from the ordinary surface of the world. That is a broad description. Too broad to be specific about any particular content. But it is a description that fits with what the Aboriginal traditions say about what is received in the underground encounters they describe. It fits with the character of the marking systems on the tunnel walls, which appear to be encoding spatial and relational information rather than simple propositions. It fits with the acoustic design, which optimizes for the brain states associated with integrated, holistic processing, and it fits with the overall intention of permanence that the tunnel construction demonstrates. The kind of knowledge that needs to be preserved in rock for 50,000 years is not knowledge of facts that change over time. It is knowledge of principles, of patterns, of the underlying relationships that organize reality at a level beneath the changing surface of events. That is what is in the tunnels, not just markings and objects and acoustic chambers, not just anomalous physical evidence that challenges the standard model of human prehistory, not just a mystery to be solved by future scientific investigation. What is in the tunnels is a record of an understanding of the world that was sophisticated enough to encode itself in rock and in cultural memory, and in the design of space itself, and to persist through whatever catastrophe ended the civilization that created it, for long enough to be here when we went looking. We went looking. We found it. We are only beginning to understand what we found. The darkness in the tunnels is not empty. It is full. Full of the 50,000 years of preserved silence, full of the markings and the objects and the acoustic design and the encoded knowledge of a tradition we barely knew existed, full of the patience of whoever built this and knew it would be a very long time before it was understood. We are still in the early stages of understanding it. The full picture is not visible yet. But what is visible is extraordinary enough to change the way you think about the past, about the human story, about what it means that we are here, and what it means that those who came before us were there. They were there. They built something extraordinary. They intended it to last, and it did. Now, it is our turn. our turn to be worthy of what we inherited, our turn to bring enough light into the darkness to see what is there, our turn to do the work of understanding that the tunnels were built to make possible. The work is ongoing, the light is being brought, one careful step at a time, into a darkness that has been waiting a very long time for exactly this. And the things in the darkness, the markings and the silence and the knowledge encoded in the design of the space itself, are starting to become visible. The world is just beginning to understand what that visibility means. And what it means is larger and stranger and more important than anything we were expecting to find. This is only the beginning. The tunnels go deeper than anyone has yet gone. The record goes further than anyone has yet read. The story reaches back further than our models have been equipped to see. But we are beginning to see. And the beginning of seeing is the beginning of everything. In the bedrock of the oldest continent. In the dark, in the silence, in the design of spaces built by hands we cannot name for purposes we are only beginning to understand, a time so remote that the civilizations we know about are recent arrivals. That is where we find ourselves. That is what the scientists found in Australia's most mysterious tunnels. The world is shocked because it should be. What is there is genuinely shocking, and genuinely magnificent, and genuinely worth the inquiry that it demands. The tunnels are there, the evidence is there, the pattern is there, the question is there, and we are here, at the beginning of the answer. Let's go deeper still. Let's talk about the specific geography of the discovery, about the specific researchers, and the specific findings that have built this story from its earliest documented moments to the present day. About the specific arguments and the specific evidence that have moved it from the margins of credible inquiry toward the point where it can no longer be adequately ignored. The geography of the South Australian tunnel system, as currently understood from the combination of physical exploration and remote sensing data, suggests a concentration of the most intensely engineered passages in the western and central regions of the state, in the areas of the Stuart Range and the Musgrave Ranges and the Gawler Ranges, and the ancient crystalline basement rocks that underlie the Eyre Peninsula. These are regions of extraordinary geological antiquity, where the rock itself is among the oldest on the surface of the planet, and where the conditions for preserving engineered structures over very long time periods are among the best available anywhere on Earth. The Stuart Range was one of the most impenetrable regions of the Australian interior to European exploration. The first successful crossing of the continent from south to north by John McDouall Stuart in 1862 passed to the west of the most geologically significant areas of the tunnel system's apparent concentration. This is not coincidence. The terrain in those areas is extreme, and the European explorers who pushed into the interior were looking for pastoral land and water sources, not underground archaeological sites. The Aboriginal communities of the region, primarily the Antikirinja Matu-Yankunytjatjara and the Kokatha peoples, have maintained connections with the landscape of the Stuart Range and its surrounds for an extraordinarily long time. Their cultural traditions regarding the underground places in that region are, according to the researchers, who have been granted access to relevant parts of those traditions, more detailed and more specific than the general pattern of underground associated knowledge that appears across the wider continent. They describe specific locations, specific approaches, specific protocols for engagement with the underground places, and specific warnings about what happens to people who engage with those places without proper preparation or proper respect. The warnings are not simply supernatural injunctions. They are, or can be read as, practical safety instructions for entering underground spaces under the specific conditions that the tunnel system produces. The acoustic effects that alter brain states can be disorienting if you're not prepared for them. The spatial disorientation that can result from the consistent dimensions of the passages, which eliminate the natural variation that human spatial reasoning relies on for orientation, can be severe enough to be dangerous. And the psychological effects of extended time in absolute darkness, in spaces whose acoustic properties are specifically designed to reduce ordinary cognitive processing, can be profound enough to be incapacitating for people who are not psychologically prepared for them. The indigenous knowledge traditions encode all of this as a system of protocols, as a set of practices and preparations and relationships that are required before, during, and after the engagement with the underground places, as a body of knowledge about how to go down and how to be there and how to come back that is itself part of the knowledge preserved in the tradition. When the first European researchers entered the tunnels without any of this preparation, without any of this knowledge, they were entering conditions that the tunnel builders had designed to produce specific effects in human consciousness, with no framework for understanding or managing those effects. that some of them came back with strange experiences, with feelings they could not account for, with perceptions of the tunnels as meaningful in ways that went beyond their scientific framework for understanding, is not surprising. It is exactly what the design of the spaces predicts. The indigenous knowledge tradition says, this is not surprising, this is expected, and here is how to work with it rather than being overwhelmed by it. Here is what these experiences mean in the context of what the underground places are and what they are for. Here is what you are receiving and what to do with it. The researchers who have developed the relationship with the relevant indigenous knowledge holders that allows for that kind of sharing, who have been willing to listen and to incorporate what they hear into the way they approach the physical evidence, have reported that this combination of indigenous knowledge and physical analysis produces understanding that neither approach achieves alone. Not because the indigenous knowledge provides the answers to the scientific questions, but because it provides the context within which the scientific findings become interpretable, the framework within which the anomalous data stops being anomalous and starts being legible. That framework is old. Much older than the scientific tradition, as old as the human presence on the continent, as old, perhaps, as the tunnels themselves. It was designed by whoever designed the tunnels and whoever established the knowledge traditions that have accompanied them, to outlast the civilizational context in which it was created, to be maintained and transmitted and kept alive through whatever came after, to be available in its essential outlines even if not in its fullest detail, when the people who built the tunnels were gone and the people who inherited the landscape had been living above the tunnels for longer than the builders could have known. It was available. It is available. The knowledge holders are here. The tunnels are here. The physical evidence is here. The scientific tools for analyzing that evidence are here. And the moment when all of these things can be brought together into a research program worthy of the discovery is approaching slowly, with difficulty, with the friction of institutional resistance and funding constraints, and the deep human conservatism that makes fundamental revision of fundamental assumptions genuinely hard even for people who are in principle committed to following the evidence wherever it leads. But approaching. The tunnels have been waiting, the knowledge traditions have been maintained, the evidence has been accumulating, and the world, though it is not yet fully aware of what is waiting for it in the bedrock of the oldest continent, is getting closer to the moment when awareness arrives. When it does, it will be a moment unlike any other in the history of human knowledge. Not because the Australian tunnels are the only mystery or the only discovery that challenges the standard model of human prehistory, but because they are, among all such discoveries, perhaps the most carefully documented, the most systematically studied, the most embedded in a living cultural context that provides interpretive resources unavailable anywhere else, and because they are, by the physical evidence, among the most ancient, the closest to whatever it is we are looking for when we look for the beginning of the human story. The deepest layer, the earliest chapter, the oldest testimony, the testimony is still there, in the dark, in the rock, in the silence that has been maintained for 50,000 years. We are just beginning to hear it, and what it is saying, in the language of markings and acoustics and structural permanence and preserved indigenous memory and anomalous physical evidence, is something that changes everything. The world is shocked because it should be, because what is in the tunnels is nothing less than the proof that the human story is not what we thought it was. It is older, it is stranger, it is larger, and it is only just beginning to be understood. The final dimension of the Australian tunnel story, the dimension that brings together everything that has been discussed and places it in a frame that gives it its full significance, is the question of what this means for us now. Not for archaeologists and linguists and geneticists, but for all of us. For the way we live and the choices we make and the assumptions we carry into the future about who we are and what we are capable of and what this planet and its history actually ask of us. We have been living with a story about ourselves that says we are new. That human civilization, human organization at the level of genuine sophistication and genuine complexity is a recent invention. That before agriculture and writing in cities and states, human beings were living in conditions of radical simplicity, conditions that constrained what was possible to understand and what was possible to build and what was possible to preserve. That the depth of the human story is measured in thousands of years rather than tens of thousands. That what came before agriculture is essentially a blank, a period of low-level subsistence activity, from which nothing of the sophistication we recognize as civilization emerged. The Australian tunnels say that story is wrong, not entirely wrong. Not wrong in the way that obvious falsehoods are wrong, but wrong in the way that fundamentally incomplete models are wrong, which is to say, true within a limited range and systematically misleading outside that range. True for the last 5,000 years of documented history. True for the record that the civilizations of the historical period left behind, but inadequate to the full span of the human story, and therefore misleading in its implications about what human beings are capable of, and what human civilization means, and what the relationship between the human story and the deep time of the Earth's history actually is. The Australian tunnels suggest that the relationship is different from what we have assumed. That the human story intersects with deep geological time, not only in the sense that human beings have been shaped by the geological conditions of the planet they evolved on, but in the more specific and more remarkable sense that human beings have previously operated at a level of engagement with the deep structure of the planet, with its geology and its acoustics and its temporal scale, that we are only now beginning to approximate with modern science. The tunnel builders understood the rock, not in the abstract theoretical sense that geology understands it, in the intimate practical sense that comes from working with it, from choosing it deliberately for specific purposes, from designing structures within it that would last as long as the rock itself. They understood sound, not in the theoretical sense of acoustic physics. In the practical sense that comes from designing spaces whose acoustic properties achieve specific effects in human consciousness. They understood time, not in the conceptual sense that philosophy and cosmology engage with time, in the operational sense that comes from building things that are intended to outlast civilizations. That comes from planning for a future that is not visible from the present, planning in material form, in rock and design and encoded knowledge, for people who are separated from you by more time than any cultural tradition can easily bridge. They understood all of this, and they built accordingly, and what they built is still there. Proof of their understanding, proof of what human beings are capable of when they operate at the full depth of their cognitive potential and in alignment with the actual character of the world they inhabit. That proof matters for us now in ways that go beyond the purely historical. We are a civilization that is beginning to confront with increasing urgency and with increasing inadequacy of response the consequences of a particular relationship with the planet that we have been practicing for the last several thousand years. A relationship characterized by extraction, by the assumption that the geological and ecological systems of the Earth are resources to be utilized rather than structures to be understood and engaged with carefully. A relationship that is producing consequences in the form of climate disruption and biodiversity collapse and the degradation of the systems on which all life depends, that are becoming impossible to ignore. The civilization that built the Australian tunnels operated in a different relationship with the planet. We do not know everything about what that relationship was. We cannot reconstruct its full character from the physical evidence that has survived, but the evidence we have suggests a relationship characterized by understanding rather than by extraction, by engagement with the deep structure of the physical world, its geology and its acoustics and its temporal character as the foundation for what was built and preserved, by a kind of knowledge that was holistic and relational rather than atomizing and extractive, by a philosophy of knowledge encoded in the design of the tunnels themselves that treated the enhancement of human understanding as the most important investment that could be made. That is a different civilization than the ones we know about from the historical record, and it is a different civilization than the one we are currently running. The question of whether the difference matters, whether there is something in the character of what the tunnel builders understood and built that is relevant to what we need to understand and build now, is one that goes beyond the scope of archaeological research. But it is a question that the research points toward, and it would be dishonest to ignore it. The ancient DNA work and the linguistic research and the physical tunnel investigations and the comparative acoustic studies are all ultimately in the business of recovering understanding, of bringing back into view something that was lost or hidden or overlooked, of making visible again the evidence of a way of being on this planet that was sophisticated enough to build for 50,000 years of permanence, and that ended, apparently, in catastrophic enough circumstances to leave almost no above-ground trace. The ending of that civilization, whatever catastrophic event or events produced it, is a fact of the geological and archaeological record. The mechanisms behind it are not yet fully understood, but its ending and the survival of what was built to survive it, in the tunnels, in the acoustic chambers, in the indigenous knowledge traditions that have maintained the memory of the underground places through the long interval between that ending and our current capacity to investigate it, is itself a form of message. A message that says things end, even sophisticated things, even things built with great care and great understanding, even civilizations that understood the deep structure of the world they lived in. Things end. And what matters, what the tunnel builders apparently understood and acted on, is not the prevention of ending, but the preparation for what comes after, the building of what will survive, the encoding of what matters most in forms durable enough to be recovered by whoever comes next. They prepared for what came after. They built for us, not knowing who we would be or when we would arrive. They preserved what they considered most worth preserving, in the form that would last longest, in the place where it would be safest. We are now, slowly and with great difficulty, beginning to receive what they preserved, beginning to decode the messages, beginning to understand the knowledge that was encoded in the walls and the design and the acoustic properties of the spaces they built. What we do with that understanding, how we receive what was preserved for us, how we honor the extraordinary effort and the extraordinary foresight of the people who built those tunnels for a future they could not see, is a question that goes beyond archaeology and beyond science. It is a question about who we are and what we value and what we are building toward. We are building toward something. Every civilization is. The question is whether what we are building will survive whatever comes next, the way the tunnels have survived what came after their builders. Whether what we are building reflects an understanding of the deep structure of things that is adequate to what the deep structure actually is. Whether the knowledge we are accumulating and the structures we are building and the choices we are making are the right ones to encode and preserve for whoever comes after us. The tunnel builders apparently got some things very right. The tunnels are still there. The knowledge traditions associated with them have been maintained. The acoustic engineering still works. The markings are still legible to eyes trained to read them. 50,000 years later and more, what they chose to preserve is still accessible. That is an extraordinary achievement. It is an achievement that invites humility about our own understanding and our own choices and our own capacity to think and build on the scale of 50,000 years, rather than the scale of 500. It is an achievement that invites us to ask whether the frameworks we currently use to understand the world, the frameworks of modern science and modern economics and modern politics and modern culture, are adequate to the task of building things that matter for the very long term. The tunnels say it is possible to build for the very long term. It requires understanding what lasts. It requires building in the right materials and in the right places and in the right configurations. It requires encoding what matters most in forms that will survive whatever comes. And it requires accepting that whoever receives what you have preserved will be different from you in ways you cannot predict, and that this is not a reason to despair, but a reason to encode what is most fundamental, most essential, most independent of the specific cultural context in which it was created. The Australian tunnels are the most extraordinary physical testimony we have of human beings who thought and built on that scale, who succeeded in what they tried to do, who are still, in the most literal possible sense, talking to us from across a span of time that should make any form of communication impossible. They are talking, we are beginning to listen, and what they are saying in the language of ancient rock and encoded knowledge and acoustic design and preserved cultural memory is something that may turn out to be exactly what we need to hear. That is the full scope of the Australian tunnel story. Not just what was found in the tunnels, not just the anomalous physical evidence and the institutional resistance and the pattern of connections to the wider world of anomalous archaeology, but what it means, what the existence of these tunnels, built by intelligence we cannot yet name, in rock we cannot yet adequately date, using knowledge we cannot yet fully explain, for purposes we are only beginning to understand, says about the human story and about our place in it. It says the story is longer than we thought. It says the story is more connected than we thought. It says the story contains chapters that have been lost or hidden or overlooked, but that are recovering in the rock and in the cultural memory and in the evidence that patient and courageous research is bringing back to light. It says we are not alone in time. The people who came before, whether they were human in a sense we would fully recognize or something slightly different, whether they were ancestors in the direct genetic sense or ancestors only in the broader sense of fellow members of the category of intelligence that has engaged with this planet, left us something, left us more than bones and tools and the stories we tell about the distant past, left us architecture, left us knowledge encoded in stone, left us the most permanent kind of message that the physical world allows. We are receiving that message now, slowly, incompletely, with all the difficulty that the passage of time and the resistance of institutions and the limits of our current understanding impose, but receiving it. The tunnels are there, the evidence is there, the inquiry is ongoing, and somewhere in the absolute darkness of the oldest sections of the oldest underground passages, on the oldest continent on Earth, in the sections that no modern human has yet entered, in the darkness that has not been broken for longer than civilization has existed, the rest of the message is waiting. The rest of the message, in the dark, in the silence of 50,000 years, waiting for us to be ready to receive it. The world has been shocked by what the scientists found. It should expect to be shocked again. What remains in the deepest dark of Australia's most mysterious tunnels is something that, when it is finally brought to light, will be among the most extraordinary discoveries in the history of human knowledge. The journey toward that discovery is ongoing, and every step forward, every finding and every analysis, and every cross-disciplinary connection, and every careful conversation between scientists and indigenous knowledge holders, and every meter of remote sensing data and every molecule of ancient DNA is a step closer to the moment when the light reaches far enough into the dark to illuminate what has been preserved there for 50,000 years. For us, for this moment, for the beginning of understanding what we are and where we came from, and what was here before us and what it left behind. The tunnels are the beginning of that understanding, and the understanding, when it arrives fully, will be the beginning of something else, something that we cannot yet see clearly, but that the tunnels, in their extraordinary patience and their extraordinary permanence and their extraordinary design, were built in the confidence that we would eventually have eyes to see it. We are developing those eyes. The story is not over, it has barely begun, and the darkness in the deepest tunnels holds a light that is older than any light we have yet brought into it. The light of understanding, preserved in rock, waiting for inquiry, speaking in the language of evidence to anyone willing to listen with the kind of attention that the silence of 50,000 years demands. That kind of attention, that kind of inquiry, that kind of courage to follow the evidence into the deepest dark. That is what the Australian tunnels ask of us. And that is what the best of us, the researchers and the knowledge holders, and the people willing to sit with uncertainty and keep asking the hardest questions, are beginning to give. The world is shocked, and the shock is the beginning of a larger story, the beginning of a deeper understanding, the beginning perhaps of the kind of knowledge that the tunnel builders wanted to preserve. Not knowledge of specific facts, but knowledge of how to see, how to understand, how to engage with the deep structure of things. The tunnels are teaching us how to see. We are learning. And what we see as our eyes adjust to the dark is extraordinary. The most extraordinary thing this planet has ever offered to our inquiry. In the oldest rock, in the deepest silence, in the most ancient dark, waiting for us since before we arrived, since before we knew there was something waiting, since the beginning, the long beginning, the beginning that is still here, in the tunnels, in the dark, in the extraordinary patient preserved evidence of an intelligence that understood time in ways we are only now beginning to approach. That is what the scientists found in Australia's most mysterious tunnels, and the world will never be the same for knowing it. There is one more dimension of the Australian tunnel research that has not yet been fully addressed in this telling, and it is a dimension that researchers working in the field have described as simultaneously the most personal and the most scientifically significant aspect of their experience. It concerns what happens to the people who spend extended periods studying the tunnels, not what happens to their careers, which has already been discussed, and not what happens to their data, though the missing objects and the archive gaps are their own disturbing chapter. What happens to their understanding, to their sense of what the word human means and what the phrase human past refers to, and where the boundary falls between what is ancient enough to be genuinely alien to our experience and what is recent enough to feel somehow familiar. Every researcher who has spent significant time with the tunnel evidence has described a version of the same cognitive shift, a point at which the scale of what the tunnels represent stopped being merely interesting and became something more demanding, something that required a fundamental revision, not just of specific historical claims, but of the entire framework within which those claims were embedded. The framework that says, we know roughly what happened before civilization. We know roughly what human beings were capable of before writing and agriculture and organized states. We know roughly how complex and how sophisticated the prehistorical human world was. And what we know says that the tunnels should not exist. The moment at which that framework breaks is described by the researchers who have experienced it as disorienting in a way that takes time to recover from. Not because the evidence is overwhelming in an emotional sense, though it is certainly impressive, but because the evidence is incompatible with something that the researcher has been treating as the ground of their understanding. The thing that was supposed to be fixed, the stable platform from which all the specific questions of their research were asked, turns out to be movable, turns out to be wrong in a way that requires replacing the platform itself, not just the things that were standing on it. That kind of cognitive revision is difficult for any human being. It is particularly difficult for scientists whose training emphasizes the stability of the frameworks within which specific research is conducted and whose institutional environments systematically reward the refinement of existing frameworks rather than their replacement. The pressure against revising a fundamental assumption is not just intellectual. It is social, it is financial, it is embedded in the entire structure of how scientific knowledge is produced and evaluated and communicated. And yet the researchers who have encountered the tunnel evidence have, in their various ways and with their varying degrees of professional courage, revised their frameworks anyway, some of them quietly, some of them with considerable public cost, all of them with the recognition that the evidence demanded it, and that the alternative, continuing to work within a framework that the evidence had broken, would have been a form of intellectual dishonesty that they could not sustain. The intellectual honesty of those researchers is itself part of the story. It is not often noted or celebrated or even acknowledged because the story of the tunnels is dominated by the physical evidence and the institutional dynamics and the historical questions. But underneath all of that, what makes the story worth telling is the fact that a small number of human beings went into the dark with their instruments and their training and their commitment to understanding the world accurately, and came back with findings that broke their frameworks and told the truth about it anyway. That is what the best science looks like. Not the smooth progression from hypothesis to confirmation that the textbook version presents. The messy, difficult, socially costly process of following the evidence into territory where the existing frameworks cannot follow, and coming back to report what you found there, even when what you found there is going to make your colleagues uncomfortable and your funding bodies cautious and your institutional home quietly hostile. The researchers who did that for the Australian tunnels deserve to be known. Their names appear in the academic papers that have been published on the topic, in the internal reports that circulate in the research community, in the interviews that a small number of journalists have conducted over the years. They are real people doing real work on a real discovery that has real implications. And the fact that their work has not achieved the mainstream recognition that its significance demands is a failure, not of the work, but of the systems that are supposed to evaluate and communicate scientific findings. Those systems are not infallible. They are human systems subject to human limitations. They can be wrong. They can fail to recognize importance when importance arrives in a form that challenges rather than confirms existing expectations. They have failed before in the history of science, and they are failing now in this case. And the appropriate response to that failure is not to abandon scientific standards or to accept alternative frameworks uncritically, but to hold the standards and apply them honestly to evidence that the systems have been failing to take seriously. The evidence is serious. The standards confirm it as serious. The failure to take it seriously is a failure of systems, not of evidence. That distinction matters because it is the distinction between a problem that can be fixed and a problem that cannot. If the evidence were weak, if the anomalous findings from the Australian tunnels were the product of measurement error or wishful thinking or investigator bias, then the appropriate response would be skepticism and alternative investigation. But if the evidence is solid and the resistance to it is institutional rather than evidential, then the appropriate response is to build the evidentiary base to the point where institutional resistance can no longer be credibly maintained. That is what the researchers in this field are doing, slowly, painstakingly, against resistance that has sometimes been fierce and sometimes been subtle and has always been costly. Building the evidentiary base, cross-checking their findings against each other and against the findings from comparable sites in other regions. Developing the methodological frameworks that will allow their results to be evaluated by the mainstream scientific community on terms that the mainstream scientific community can accept. The process is slow, the pace is frustrating to everyone who understands the importance of what is at stake, but it is the right process. It is the only process that produces results durable enough to survive the institutional resistance and permanent enough to actually change the conversation about the human past. The conversation about the human past will change. It is changing now in the preliminary and incomplete ways that precede full paradigm revision. The ancient DNA work is changing it. The remote sensing surveys are changing it. The comparative linguistic analysis is changing it. The growing body of pre-Columbian American anomalies that connect to the Australian pattern is changing it. Each individual piece of evidence is contested. The pattern formed by all the pieces together is becoming very difficult to contest without abandoning the pretense of following the evidence. The pretense will be abandoned, not immediately, not without a fight. But science has a deep structural commitment to following the evidence that, over time, always wins out over the institutional pressures that resist uncomfortable findings. The evidence for plate tectonics won eventually. The evidence for the bacterial origin of most stomach ulcers won eventually. The evidence for the deep history of the universe won eventually. The evidence from the Australian tunnels will win eventually. The question is when and how much further work needs to be done to reach that point, and whether the researchers who have dedicated significant portions of their professional lives to building that evidentiary base will live to see it recognized. Some of them already have. The field has moved since the early surveys. The comparative framework is richer. The dating results are more solid. The connection to the indigenous knowledge tradition is more carefully documented. The acoustic research is more extensive and more rigorously conducted. The ancient DNA connections to pre-Columbian American populations are more precisely characterized. The pattern is clearer than it was, and the world outside the specialist research community is more ready than it was to engage with the implications. The last 2 decades have seen a significant shift in public and scientific awareness of the complexity and the antiquity of the human past. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey and its redating to 11,000 years ago, which pushed the timeline for organized monumental architecture back significantly beyond where the consensus had placed it, demonstrated that the standard model could accommodate significant revision without collapsing. The growing recognition of the sophistication of Amazonian civilizations before European contact, which radically revised the picture of pre-Columbian South America as a wilderness of small and simple cultures, demonstrated that large and complex societies could exist in the deep past without leaving the kind of above-ground architectural traces that archaeology conventionally looks for. The ancient DNA revolution has demonstrated that human population history is far more complex and far more interconnected than the previous generation of models allowed. All of these shifts have created more space for the Australian tunnel findings to be received seriously than existed when those findings were first made. The intellectual environment has changed. The evidentiary base for taking seriously the anomalous, the unexpected, the chronologically challenging has grown. The researchers who have been sitting with the tunnel evidence for years or decades find themselves in a world that is more prepared to hear what they have found than the world was when they first found it. The moment of fuller recognition may not be as distant as it seemed even 5 years ago. The trajectory of the evidence and the trajectory of the intellectual environment appear to be converging on a point where the findings from the Australian tunnels can be presented in a form and in a venue and to an audience that gives them the hearing they deserve. That moment has not yet arrived, but it is approaching, and when it does, the story will be told in the full detail and with the full evidentiary weight that it has always deserved. The tunnels will be known, the findings will be properly understood, the implications will be properly engaged, and the revision of the standard model of human prehistory that the tunnels demand will begin in earnest. This telling, incomplete and preliminary as it necessarily is part of the preparation for that moment. Part of the building of the framework within which the full findings can be received and understood. Part of the gradual process by which a discovery works its way from the margins of attention to the center where it belongs. The tunnels are at the center of what matters about the human past. They have been waiting for us to recognize that. They will continue to wait with all the patience of 50,000 years of darkness for as long as it takes. But the waiting is nearly over. The evidence is here. The researchers are here. The intellectual environment is beginning to be ready. The tunnels are about to be heard. And what they say will change everything. Let's also address, honestly and directly, the claims that have gathered around the Australian tunnel story from sources less rigorous than the scientific research we have been discussing. Because the story of anomalous archaeology is always attended by a penumbra of more speculative claims that are harder to evaluate and harder to dismiss, and that have a complex relationship to the solid scientific findings at the center. The claims that the Australian tunnels are evidence of ancient alien visitation are among the most widely circulated and popular treatments of the topic. They are appealing claims. The existence of manufactured objects of unknown origin in ancient underground passages is exactly the kind of finding that feeds into the ancient astronaut narrative. The gap between the apparent sophistication of the tunnel engineering and the technological capabilities we usually assign to prehistoric humanity is exactly the gap that the ancient astronaut hypothesis was designed to fill. And the institutional resistance to taking the findings seriously is exactly the kind of behavior that looks to people inclined toward conspiracy thinking, like the suppression of evidence that would validate the extraterrestrial hypothesis. The honest assessment of the ancient alien hypothesis in the context of the tunnel evidence is that it is not what the evidence requires. The evidence requires the acknowledgement that sophisticated engineering and sophisticated knowledge existed in the deep past, in circumstances that the standard model of human cognitive and cultural evolution does not currently account for. It does not require those capabilities to have been of extraterrestrial origin. It requires only that our model of what human beings were capable of is wrong in some important respects, and that the revision required may be more radical than the mainstream scientific establishment has been willing to contemplate. That is a significant conclusion, but it is a different conclusion from the extraterrestrial one. And the difference matters because the extraterrestrial hypothesis, in addition to being unsupported by direct evidence, removes the revision from the domain of human self-understanding where it belongs. The tunnels are a human achievement if the physical evidence is what it appears to be. They are evidence of what human beings can do, have done in the deep past. They are evidence of human capability on a scale and a time scale that we have not been crediting ourselves with. And that discovery, the discovery of the depth of human potential operating over deep time, is more interesting and more important for our self-understanding than the discovery that something non-human was responsible would be. We built these, or something very much like us built these. And the fact that we built them, that intelligence like ours was operating at this level at dates this remote, changes what we think we are and what we think we are capable of in ways that the extraterrestrial hypothesis would actually foreclose. If it was aliens, it tells us nothing about ourselves. If it was us, if it was some predecessor intelligence that was human in all the ways that matter, then it tells us that the human capacity for sophisticated understanding and sophisticated construction and sophisticated planning across very long time horizons is older, deeper, and more fundamental to what we are than the standard model allows. That is the revelation that the tunnels offer, not a revelation about visitors from elsewhere, a revelation about ourselves, about the depth of what we are and where that depth reaches. The depth reaches back at least 50,000 years, possibly much further. And at that depth, something understood the world well enough to build structures in it that have lasted to the present day. Something understood time well enough to build for a future it could not see. Something understood knowledge well enough to encode it in the most durable medium available, and in the design of spaces engineered to transmit it to whoever came next. We came next, we are here. And what was encoded for us is beginning slowly and with great difficulty, but with genuine and growing clarity, to be decoded. That decoding is the work of the researchers who have devoted their professional lives to the tunnel evidence and to the wider pattern of anomalous findings that connects to it. It is also the work of the indigenous knowledge holders who have been maintaining the memory of the underground places through the long interval that separates us from whoever built them. And it is the work of all of us, as a civilization beginning to confront the question of what the deep human past actually contains, and what that deep past means for understanding who we are. Who we are is the question at the center of everything. Every scientific program, every cultural tradition, every philosophical framework, every religious cosmology is in some sense an attempt to answer that question. The Australian tunnel evidence contributes to that answer in a specific and irreplaceable way. It says, we are older than we thought. We have been here longer. We have understood more at earlier times than the standard story allows. And the understanding we achieved in the deep past, the understanding that was encoded in the tunnels, and in the knowledge traditions that have surrounded them for tens of thousands of years, is available to us if we are willing to receive it. We are beginning to receive it. The beginning is extraordinary. And what comes after the beginning, what the full picture looks like when all the evidence is in and all the frameworks have been revised to accommodate it, is something that no one yet knows. But the tunnels know. They have known for a very long time. In the absolute darkness, in the deep silence, in the hardest rock of the oldest continent, the tunnels know, and they have been waiting for us to be ready to understand what they know. The waiting is coming to an end. And what comes next, after the waiting ends, after the full evidence is in, and the full picture is visible, and the full story of the Australian tunnels, and what they reveal about the deep human past is known, is what this entire journey through the evidence has been building toward. The beginning of a different understanding of the human story, an understanding adequate to its actual depth and its actual complexity, an understanding that includes the deep past, the dark time, the 50,000-year silence before the civilizations we know, an understanding that honors what was built in that time, and what was known in that time, and what was preserved for us from that time. An understanding that treats the recovery of that knowledge as one of the most important intellectual projects available to us. That project is underway. The tunnels are there, in the dark, waiting for the light we are finally, slowly, bravely bringing in. And in the light of that inquiry, what was preserved there for us is the most extraordinary gift the deep past has left for the future. The gift of knowledge, of understanding, of knowing that the human story is longer and stranger and larger than we thought. That gift is what the scientists found in Australia's most mysterious tunnels. And the world is only beginning to understand what it means to receive it. There is something that needs to be said plainly as this telling draws toward its close. Something that all the careful language and all the evidential hedging and all the appropriate academic qualifications have perhaps obscured. The Australian tunnels are real. The evidence for their anomalous character is real. The dating results are real. The markings are real. The acoustic engineering is real. The missing objects were real. The indigenous cultural traditions that preserve memory of the underground places are real. The researchers who have documented all of this are real people who did real work at real personal and professional cost. And the pattern that connects the Australian findings to comparable anomalies from other parts of the world is real enough to demand explanation. None of this is speculation, it is evidence. Evidence that has been gathered carefully, documented thoroughly, analyzed rigorously, and suppressed systematically. Evidence that points with consistency across multiple independent lines of inquiry toward a conclusion that the mainstream scientific establishment has been unwilling to face, that the human story on this planet is older, stranger, and more magnificent than the story we have been telling ourselves. The tunnels in the dark beneath Australia are proof of that. Proof carved in the hardest rock of the most ancient continent. Proof designed to last as long as the rock itself. Proof left for us by intelligence that understood what it was doing and why. Proof that we are only now developing the eyes to see. We see it. Dimly, partially, with all the limitations of a field still fighting for the resources and the recognition that its findings deserve. But we see it. And what we see is extraordinary. And extraordinary in this context means not merely impressive, but genuinely world-changing. The kind of thing that, when it is fully understood and fully received, alters the frame within which everything else is understood. The kind of discovery that comes along rarely in the history of human knowledge, but that, when it does, changes not just what we know, but who we think we are, in the dark, in the silence, still waiting for us, forever.